Zionism and the spread of colonialism walk side by side.
There's an unheroic story here. American Jewish history tends to be the story of the Jewish refugees that came from Poland and Lithuania in the late 19th century. They showed up in New York, and then they worked their way up to becoming great doctors and politicians, and they became suburban, and Judaism prospered. And so that's sort of the heroic narrative, I would say, of American Jewish history. By looking at the Caribbean, where early American Jewish history should be, because North America is really the margin to the Caribbean, we see that there is, it's not a story of refugees, per se. It's not people seeking tolerance in the shores of liberty. But we see people who are slave owners, slave abusers, and in a very different kind of Jewish family than what we perceive as being the American Jewish family.
Well, cognitive dissonance started to set in. And after a while, he got so uncomfortable. He asked me about, well, what is this about? You had said something about rich Jews and involved in the enslavement of Africans. So I said, where do you want us to start? What period of history? You want us to start in the Spanish, Portuguese period of the starting of the slave trade in the 1400s and 1500s? Do you want to move us? Do you want us to move it from Seville and Lisbon on to Amsterdam and Hamburg, where the new Jewish community in those areas continued the slave trade for the Dutch, the Germans, and the English? Or do you want us to move it to Brazil and the Caribbean, and Curacao, which became the new Amsterdam, the new center of the slave trade in the Western world, centered around the Jewish immigrants that moved into Curacao? Or do you want us to move it to New York and Newport, Rhode Island? Where do you want us to start? Newport, Rhode Island, at the time of the American Revolution, was the leading slaving center in America. And that was the home of the largest Jewish community and most active, wealthy Jewish community in America. Newport, Rhode Island. Where do you want to start, Mayor? Well, what books do you have? Well, we have a book here. Aaron Lopez of Newport. In the 1750s and 60s, one of the largest slavers out of Newport, Rhode Island. A community that had a number of outstanding wealthy Jews who not only controlled a couple hundred of the slave ships, Aaron Lopez himself controlling a couple of dozen, but they controlled most, if not all, of the 30 distilleries that processed molasses from the Caribbean into rum to be sold to the Native Americans as firewater and to be sold to Africa for enslaved Africans. Where do you want to start? You want to go back into the Spanish, Sephardic, Jewish community? Then get Stephen Birmingham's, the grandees. The grandees, the Jewish rich that supported the Spanish throne and helped lay the foundation for the enslavement in the 1400s and 1500s. Even after the Jewish community was persecuted in Spain with the Inquisition in 1492, many of them that converted to Christianity stayed in Spain and helped the Spanish king and queen, who was anti-Semitic, Queen Isabella, helped her maintain the slave system against the Africans and Native Americans. Where do you want to start? Do you want to go to Amsterdam and get a book by Jonathan Israel on European Jewry in the age of mercantilism, 1550 to 1750? And there's a picture of the Amsterdam synagogue, which was the center of slave trading for the Dutch. Amsterdam became the leading port in this period of time for slavery. And it was around this synagogue that the slaving system was established. Now, we're not talking about most Jews. Most Jews were being beat up and down Europe and persecuted for being Jewish. We're talking about rich Jews, and we specifically make that distinction. We're not talking about white folks in general when we talk about oppression. We're talking about the wealthy white folks, the powerful white folks that make the decisions. So let's make some decisions, some clarity when we're talking about these things. But the documentation is there. We are now preparing the 10 volumes dealing with the Jewish relationship with the black community in reference to slavery, so we can put it in the school system. So there'll be no question about Miss Daisy, Arthur Schlesinger. Schlesinger in his book said, Dr. Jeffrey said something about the Jews involved in enslavement, and then he just leaves it there. I asked this man who called me from California, I said, what is the reference that he cites? The New York Times. I said, that's not a reference to cite. Well, they quote you being quoted from some other newspaper. I said that the original quote was not correct, and so anything else after that is not correct. Why didn't he contact me and find out what it is that we're saying? Everybody was involved in the enslavement of Africans. But if we want to deal with slavery, let's deal with it, and I'm going to lay this down. That's why we're being attacked. You see, if they had just let us put a few black folks in the curriculum and been satisfied with that, then there would be no problem, and we would have been satisfied. But they didn't want us to do that. So our intellectual abilities and capacities and our sacred mission has pushed us into serious study and analysis. No one has studied more than myself in the last couple of years and the people around me. Producing documents, position papers, Dr. Carruthers, Dr. Asante, Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Shashi McIntyre, my wife. We have been in a heavy study. And what has been revealed is a mind-boggling process. We will have the 10 major books relating to the Jewish community, the wealthy Jewish community, and enslaved. In Spain, they were the grandees, managing the money of the Spanish throne. In Germany, in the 16 and 1700s, they were the court Jews, managing the political and economic apparatus of Europe, the Hapsburg Empire, the German states, etc. We have the names. We know who they were, what they controlled. We know when they set up the Dutch East Indian Company, the Dutch West Indian Company, the Portuguese Company, the Brazilian Company. We know who and what documents. We know the family connections. We know that even when they converted to Christianity, they maintained links with their Jewish community brothers who had not converted. And that's why they had a network around the world. But even more than that, if you keep digging and as quiet as it's kept, a number of Jewish scholars from around the country sent me documentation on the Jews' involvement in slave trade. Not one wrote to me contesting what they thought I had said. A dozen sent me information.
Now, the question of Jews in the African slave trade is one which I, despite the fact that I was a professor of African history for many years, is a question that I was only dimly aware of. I had come across a little reference someplace suggesting that there was a Jewish presence in the African slave trade. But now that I am more aware of the role that Jews played, it strikes me as very interesting that I could have taught African history and black history generally, African American history, Caribbean history for so long without having a clearer sense of the involvement of Jews in that nefarious trade. And it seems to me that as I look back on this reality, it seems to me that somewhere along the line there must have been perhaps a deliberate tendency on the part of somebody, I'm not sure who, maybe book publishers, maybe historians themselves, but it seems as though there was a tendency over the years to downplay, to deliberately downplay and to obscure, to camouflage the role of Jews in the African slave trade. Now I realize that many of the people who I now know to have been Jews, who played an important role in the slave trade, were described in history books as just white or Portuguese or Spaniards or whatever. There was a tendency, and there still is a tendency, whenever Jews were involved, if it was something concerning which Jews were proud, then that person would be identified as a Jew. If it was something that concerning which Jews maybe felt that, that might cause a bad reflection on their kind, there was a tendency to sort of hide behind other people. So that Jewish racism would become white racism, or Jewish involvement in the slave trade would become Portuguese involvement, and so on. But come to find out that many of these Portuguese that are, in fact, perhaps the majority of these Portuguese, slave ship owners and so on, that David Brinkley was talking about were in fact Jews. Some were what they called Moranos, Jews who pretended to convert to Christianity, then declared their Jewishness at the first opportunity, and so on. But here was just one of many examples where the Jewish presence in this trade tended to be camouflaged, under other kinds of categorizations. The earliest multinational corporation involved in the Atlantic slave trade was something called the Dutch West India Company. And again, it often surprises people to discover that even in this early period, globalization was already a very, fairly entrenched phenomenon. The slave trade was a great example of globalization. Here you had the Dutch West India Company, out of Holland, of course, which went to West Africa. They had their own private army. They established forts on the West African coast. They had their own fleet of ships and so on. They had their own administrators. Sometimes they would govern areas. They had their own governors, administrators, and whatnot. They were almost like it was almost like colonization, via private enterprise. It was like privatized colonization, and all of this, of course, transpired with the sanction of European governments. These were like surrogate governments almost. These chartered companies, as they were often called.
The Jews were expelled from Spain on August 2nd, 1492, and from Portugal in 1497. Many of these Jews immigrated to Holland, where they set up the Dutch West Indies Company to exploit the New World.
It is a dark chapter in the Dutch history, a story about how the Dutch enriched themselves through transatlantic slave trade, piracy, and smuggling. The West India Company was founded in 1621 and was given authority to conduct business and military action in West Africa and the Americas. Initially trading tobacco, sugar, and gold, the Dutch soon excelled in the trading of African slaves. The ships of the West India Company sailed a route that became known as the Triangle Voyage. This journey started in one of the many Dutch harbors and took the ships to the Dutch forts on the African Gold Coast. Slaves were bought or traded, and as many as 700 African slaves were loaded as merchandise in each ship, and were referred to as heads, as in heads of cattle. From Africa, the ships would cross the Atlantic, sailing towards the island of Curaçao, the Dutch colony that had grown into the biggest slave depot in the Caribbean by the 1650s. The hard conditions on board, poor nutrition, and disease caused a 20% death rate among the enslaved Africans. In the reported tragedy of 1738, the Dutch slave ship Loosden sinks in front of the Suriname coast. As the crew heads for the lifeboats, 702 of the 716 slaves aboard drown, locked into the deck below. For those who made it, their future didn't seem a lot better. The weaker slaves were usually auctioned off early. The prime slaves were sold individually to the highest bidder, separated from their families. They were sold for about $100 per person, and merchants would ship them to the plantations in Suriname, Brazil, and other colonies, facing a life of endless, forced hard labor. After the ships were loaded with sugar, gold, or tobacco, they returned to the Netherlands, making the triangular voyage complete.
So the Dutch West India Company in the 1600s then was the pioneer in this kind of multinational, globalized prosecution of the slave trade. And apparently a large number of the shareholders, the stockholders in this Dutch West India Company were Jews. The Jews had been chased out of Portugal and Spain. They had been chased out of all kinds of places. They found some respite from their wanderings in Holland. They became an influential factor in Holland. But suffice it to say that they were an important element in the Dutch West India Company, which was the preeminent entity carrying on the slave trade in the early period.
But the Dutch West Indies Company, it still existed after the Dutch got expelled from Brazil. I think it existed into the late 18th century. I mean, were they around in Suriname, and do the archives of that period sort of survive?
Sure. Well, Suriname was actually governed in part by the Dutch West India Company, and one of the reasons why Jews were able to negotiate for so many privileges is that the colony was not governed by a government. It was governed by three entities: the Van Sommersdijk family, the City of Amsterdam, and the Dutch West India Company. So yes, indeed, they were part of the governing partnership until the late 18th century.
The Dutch West India Company was responsible for importing, the earliest slaves to places like Brazil, to some parts of the Caribbean, either directly or indirectly, I think, to this country as well in a very early period in the 17th century. Jews. Perhaps the best known of these is a man called Aaron Lopez.
Portuguese Aaron Lopez, who plays an important part in the overall story of the Jews and slavery. Concerning the entire commerce of the colonies and the later state of Rhode Island, which included Newport, bills of lading, concessions, receipts, and port clearances carried the signature name of Aaron Lopez. This also took place during the years 1726 to 1774. He had, therefore, more than 50% of all dealings under his personal control for almost 50 years.
The early American Jewish experience was one of rich merchants. Aaron Lopez and Newport, the great merchant prince, was building connections to Jamaica, between Newport and Jamaica.
So Aaron Lopez was out of Newport, Rhode Island. He was one of the largest slave ship owners in colonial America. This man had a fleet of ships for many years. He sent his ships to West Africa. They traveled from West Africa to the Caribbean, to Barbados, to Jamaica, St. Thomas, places like that. He had members of his family situated in the Caribbean. He had a whole network going on. And he brought slaves back here as well. Many of his slaves helped to build some famous synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island in colonial times. In many areas in the Americas, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. In Brazil, for example, in the 17th century, Jews were a dominant element in the slave trade. They owned a large number of the plantations. They were often very importantly positioned in other aspects, not necessarily the plantation aspects, but things like, say, the importation of slaves, things like the warehousing of slaves, things like the auctioning of slaves, things like the provisioning of slaves, things like manning slave ships, provisioning slave ships. In New England, for example, at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, rum became a major economic venture in New England, places like Providence, Rhode Island, places like Boston and so on. And rum was a major factor in the slave trade because rum was one of the major items of trade, one of the major items that slave ships carried when they went to West Africa to trade and exchange for slaves and so on. And I believe that at one point all the rum distilleries in Boston were owned by Jews. I think there was something like 18 or something like that rum distilleries. So in all of these areas, both directly and in terms of ancillary industries feeding the slave trade, Jews were very, very important. Apart from Brazil, Jews were again dominant factors in many other parts of the area. For example, in Curacao, a Dutch island in the Caribbean. The majority of folks involved in the slave trade in Curacao were Jews. At one point in Suriname, which again was a Dutch colony right next to Brazil in South America, Jews were again a very important part of the slave trade in Suriname. There was an English soldier by the name of John Stedman who went to Suriname in the late 1700s as part of a mercenary force raised by the Dutch to try to fight against the maroon slaves. Those were the escaped slaves who established an independent existence in the interior and gave the slave regime a lot of trouble. And Stedman wrote a very fascinating book concerning his experiences in Suriname, and there are several references in Stedman's book to the presence of Jewish slave owners and so on. There was one large plantation area in Suriname called Jew Savannah. Jew Savannah.
In 1639, the first Jews to arrive in Suriname were Sephardic Jews, or Portuguese Jews. Threatened by persecution, they had fled their homes in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. It was via the Netherlands that they made the journey to Suriname. At a later time, the Ashkenazi Jews, or High German Jews, arrived in Suriname. They originated from Poland and Russia. They established a settlement known as Tararica, which is located 40 kilometers south of the current capital, Paramaribo. There they would establish the first ever sugar plantations. Soon enough, English Jews and Jews from Brazil made the trek to Suriname and settled near the Cassipora Creek, a place now known as Joden Savannah.
the Jews of Suriname, and arguably in the Atlantic world in general, did not see their exile as a punishment, but rather they saw it as an opportunity to forge these new frontier communities, which by virtue of being frontier communities afforded Jews the potential for garnering an array of privileges and economic opportunities. So I think that helps to explain why so many historians expected Joden Savannah, Jews Savannah in Suriname, to be a utopian, proto-Zionist settlement. Suriname was in a way the heartland of the Jewish Atlantic world, and as I show statistically in an appendix of my book, about 1/4 of all Jews living in the Americas found their home in Suriname. So the story of Suriname is also an important reminder to historians, especially American Jewish historians, that the story of Jews in the Americas is not a story primarily of liberty and freedom. And the literature up till now has argued that the Americas afforded these wonderful opportunities of freedom and egalitarianism for its Jewish immigrants and their descendants. But in fact, that is a very skewed picture. And if we center slave society, we can see that that liberty and those privileges and that egalitarianism was always the flip side of the coin of unfreedom, and in the case of Suriname, of slavery. And as we know, of course, during that era, human beings were property. Enslaved human beings were considered legal property. And so Jews they enjoyed the privilege of owning enslaved people. These are people primarily from the west coast of Africa, but also a number of indigenous groups came to be owned by Jews. The people living in Joden Savannah were Portuguese Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews were actually not allowed to live in Joden Savannah. It was a thoroughly Portuguese Jewish residential environment. But the people coming in were not direct refugees from the Iberian Peninsula. They had stopped in the metropoles of Europe where Judaism was legal starting in the 1590s, and that is Amsterdam, thereafter London, also Bordeaux, and they underwent formal conversion to Judaism in those places. And only then, and often after a lot of meandering throughout the Atlantic world as Jews, only then did they settle in Suriname and in Joden Savannah. And incidentally, the word Joden Savannah means Jews Savannah. Joden means Jews in Dutch. Savannah is actually an Indian word, indigenous word, and it refers to a landscape that is a treeless plain. They had chopped away part of the rainforest in order to establish their settlement. So Joden Savannah was a village, but it was surrounded by dozens of Jewish-owned plantations, which I will soon talk about. The largesse of the community leaders who acquired their wealth through primarily plantation ownership. And they cleared away the rainforest, sometimes with their own labor power, but most often with the labor power of the enslaved people that they brought from Africa. And they set up plantations, which, as I mentioned before, were primarily sugar plantations, but also coffee, cocoa, cotton, and to some extent, especially in the late 18th century, timber plantations. So if you turned back time and you went to Suriname in the 18th century, you would see that a very large portion of the Suriname River, this is the Suriname River traversing from north to south. The map is quote unquote upside down from a North American perspective, from a Northern Hemisphere perspective. And you can see where the circle is. This is the main stretch of the Suriname River where the Portuguese Jewish plantations were concentrated. There were also Ashkenazi owners of plantations, but they did not settle in this region, which again was dominated by Portuguese Jews. You do find some Ashkenazi-owned plantations in other rivers, including the Kommerwijne River, which are tributaries directly east and west on this map that you're seeing. And the Jews gave Jewish names primarily to their plantations.
And they weren't just empowered through their autonomy, but empowered by the fact that they were living in a slave society. So they had mastery over humans, other human beings that really very much exceeds anything that we see in Europe. Even in the Ottoman world, where Jews had extensive slave ownership, but living in a slave society in which the majority of the people who lived there were enslaved, gives Jews who are living in an autonomous, at least before 1770, almost entirely in Yoden Savannah, in this Jewish city, this Jewish town, really unparalleled autonomy, but also mastery. And I think that this is a very important way of conceiving of an anti-lachrymose Jewish history.
Jews were also very prominently present in non-Dutch parts of the Caribbean, places like Barbados, places like Jamaica, St. Thomas, and many of the other islands as well.
Because of difference of opinion on religion and finance, the people in Europe of the Hebrew faith in their various branches became good at certain bargaining things, money lending, fabric design and fabric manufacturers, theater management, department store management. And in Germany, where they had department stores, they had the fabrics, they had communication. There's a book called Barbados, the First Israel by Lionel Hutchison, when the Jews were driven out of England before Cromwell invited them back. Barbados was the leading Jewish colony of the world. And when we look at Christopher Columbus and his exploration, why did some countries in South America have 16 synagogues? If they didn't have no Jews, what would they do with so many synagogues? And who was Columbus in the first place? No one ever proved he was Spanish. No one ever proved he was Italian. There's 7 different places where they say he was born. Faker, hustler, con man who discovered nothing. Some evidence proved he was Jews. Why did the Jews have to leave Spain? They were the money managers of Spain, the grandees. All this is so well documented. There's a book by a Jewish writer, I think, William Katz, and it's called Israel in Europe. Read the chapter called The Jews in Spain.
Now, recently we've discovered that Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, was known as a quote-unquote Marrano. Marrano? The Marranos are those that were forced to convert to Roman Catholicism, that were Sephardim.
What is the Jewish link to the discovery of America? There is speculation that Christopher Columbus may have been Jewish. The astronomical charts that he used on his historic voyage were prepared by Abraham Zacuto, a Jew. It is also known that members of his crew were Jewish. In the same year that Columbus left Spain for the New World, as many as 160,000 Jews were expelled from Spain. In 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain decreed that Spanish Jews convert to Catholicism or leave the country within 4 months. This expulsion brought an abrupt end to the troubled yet illustrious history of Spanish Jewry. The Jews of Spain knew both times of religious tolerance and times of cruel persecution. But Spain also offered a period of enlightenment for Spanish Jewry. In the 8th century, Arabs occupied most of Spain and welcomed the Jews. Traditional Jewish thought meshed with contemporary Arabic culture, and in the 10th and 11th centuries, a period which became known as the Golden Age, Jewish culture reached unprecedented heights. Columbus sailed to the New World while the Jews of Spain scattered to foreign lands: Africa, Asia, Holland, England, Turkey, Greece, and Palestine.
Okay, I find it absolutely mortifying that we're going to claim Columbus as one of our own as a Jew, because Columbus is such a problematic character and begins the beginning of the European, let's call it the invasion, and in a sense destruction of the native populations of South America and North America. So I don't know. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean he wasn't a secret Jew. And I know for sure, Rabbi, that there were Marranos or conversos and secret Jews who made their way with the Spanish conquest to South and North America. There's no question about that. But I really want to ask, are we happy to claim Columbus as our own? Is he a secret Jewish hero?
I believe he is. I believe that Anthony Baratta, who is the president of the Order of the Sons and Daughters of Italy in America, he wrote something recently. He said that regardless of what you think about Columbus, he joined the old world of Europe to the new world of what was to become America, and his voyage changed the world forever. So, do we claim him as a Jew? Well, when you said that, yes, indeed. I'm going to go back to one little point you made, because you said, yes, indeed, there were Moranos on Columbus's ships. Yes, and you agreed to that. Well, I would say to you, who's going to let Jews on a ship except another Jew who happened to be captain or organizer of the entire expedition? And so, what do we know about Columbus's background? Well, first of all, we know that his surname was Colon. Colon is a recognizable Spanish and Italian Jewish surname. We believe that he was a secret Jew, and because he worked alongside of fellow Jews during the horrors of the persecution that were brought on by the Inquisition. Also, in an opinion piece on a CNN blog in 2012, an author by the name of Charles Garcia, actually I should call him a historian, he summarized what historians have long suspected and believe now that they've been able to corroborate, and that is that Columbus wrote and spoke in Castilian Spanish, which was Ladino, and in his letters that he wrote, he signed them off with the phrase meaning "with God's help," that only Spanish Jews wrote on their letters as a way of being able to identify one to another. But the most compelling evidence is in the museum, the Maritime Museum in Genoa, Italy. And there you can see Columbus's manifests from various of the many voyages that he took. And what is the most compelling evidence of all is that when he was evaluating his sailors, who was good, who was bad, who was obedient, who wasn't, he wrote in Hebrew. All of these manifests you can see written in Hebrew with the names of the sailors and how effective they were working on the ships. Now we know that October 12, 1492 was an important date for two reasons, and of course the obvious one is the day that Columbus set sail. Actually, it was also the same date that the Spanish Jews, by law, were given the choice of accepting forced conversion or leaving Spain, and leaving Spain, or if they remained, they would be arrested. So the fact that that date holds two very important historical events is part of my argument that Columbus was indeed a secret Jew.
And Columbus needs to be given his proper kudos. Columbus was the leading drum major for slavery. He started the transatlantic slave trade. And when he couldn't bring enough gold back to Spain and Portugal, to his mentors who were the Sephardic Jews who had converted to Catholicism, who ran the money system and statecraft around the Spanish throne, when he couldn't bring back enough gold, as he promised Queen Isabella so she could continue the Crusades, he brought hundreds of Native Americans across the Atlantic as enslaved persons.
Christopher Columbus was an experienced sailor long before his infamous voyage west. Sir Arthur Helps writes that, in the course of his letters, Columbus speaks after the fashion of a practiced slave dealer. In fact, in 1498, his 5-ship expedition brought 600 Indians to Spain as slaves. 200 were given to the masters of the ships, and 400 sold in Spain. Columbus employed slave labor in gold mining even before sailing for the New World. He helped to start the Portuguese West African settlement of San Jorge el Mina, St. George of the Mines, in present-day Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast. When the Spaniards found gold in the New World, reports Eric Rosenthal in his book, Gold, 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 the Johannesburg Gold Rush, they started, quote, on a gold hunt of such intensity that the natives came to believe the white men suffered from some disease curable only by the limitless application of this metal. When Columbus discovered that, apart from some poor alluvial deposits, the gold simply did not exist, he forced the harmless Indian aborigines into slavery. The entire importation of gold from the New World for the first 20 years after 1492 represented in cash only $300,000 a year, and the total then recovered, worth about $5 million, cost at least 1.5 million Indian lives. Columbus was anything but a blessing to the New World population. The Europeans, led by Columbus, brought unprecedented brutality to the West, leaving the remains of whole communities of red people in their wake. On Hispaniola, Columbus found gold and a docile Arawak population. He lavished praise on the natives and gained their trust and affection, and then proceeded to enslave them. According to Columbus, they are without arms, all naked and without skill at arms, and great cowards, 1,000 running away from 3, and thus they are good to be ordered about, to be made to work, plant, and do whatever is wanted, to build towns and be taught to go clothed and accept our customs. Cities began to spring up all over the land of Hispaniola. The traffic in slaves, African and Indian, grew rapidly, and some Jews were engaged in this trade as agents for the royal families of Spain and Portugal. Whether or not Columbus was a Jew, as so many Jewish historians now claim, has not been definitely proven. It is clear that his brutality against the enslavement of the native population was financed by Jewish investors. The history books appear to have confused the word Jews for the word jewels. Queen Isabella's jewels had no part in the finance of Columbus's expedition, but her Jews did.
So if you want to give Columbus his proper due, let's make him the leading drum major for slavery and the initiator for transatlantic enslavement. But we don't do that. We have parades for Columbus Day, and that history is not revealed. But our role as historians and people involved in African history is to reveal the history. But people don't want us to do it. Not all the Europeans covering it up. And one of the key European groups covering it up have been the European Jewish folks, because they say their hands are clean. And when I look at their hands, it's dripping with blood. Okay. And so they say we were involved in civil rights, but I said before the civil rights movement of the 60s, where were you?
In the 1860s.
And let's go back a few hundred years and put you in the middle of enslavement. And they say we were not there. I said, well, your records tell us that we're there. I have 50 or 60 books on enslavement, and 35 of them are written by Jewish scholars on the Jewish involvement in slavery. So if you don't want us to know about your involvement, then you have to tell your people to stop writing the books and burn those they already have. As long as those books are there, we're going to study it. As long as it involves our history, we're going to reveal it. So the big attack on me for the last 10 years has been because I mentioned that some Jews, rich Jews, were involved in enslavement. Well, that's a no-no. Nobody's supposed to say that, but it's the truth.
It's okay for them to write it, but it's not okay for you to mention it.
And to analyze it in terms of your history and your struggles and what's happened to your people. But that's also true of people like the Dutch. They don't raise as much vocal hell as the Jewish people, but the Dutch were the leading slavers.
Would the Dutch be the same people that we find in Azania, or as some people know, are referred to as South Africa?
Yes, and because of their enslavement system, that's how they found themselves in Azania, South Africa, because in 1652, as they were trying to rip off the slave system from the Portuguese, along with the British, and they had several wars with the British, they had to leave. They were trying to find trade or enslavement in the Pacific and Indian Ocean as well as in the Atlantic. So stopping in what is now called Cape Town area was a fueling stop for the ships on their way to the Indian Ocean. So we need to tie in the Dutch involvement in Asia along with the Dutch involvement in the Atlantic. And then you need to put the Jewish community in with the Dutch to see partners in the crime against humanity. And it was mainly rich Jews, because the Dutch had no need for poor Jews. They said, bring your rich Jews to Amsterdam and join us in our attempt to take the slave system from the Catholics. So they did that. They attempted in 1595 to take Brazil, to take Elmina here along the coast of Ghana. They weren't successful. They kept trying, but by 1630 they took Brazil, Pernambuco and Recife. By 1637 they came to the west coast of Africa. They took Elmina from the Portuguese, and then they went down the coast and took Dahomey and Angola, and in that period of time they also got Gorée. So they controlled the slave system from which people were pulled out of Africa to go into the enslavement in the New World. And in the 1640s also, they went to war with Portugal, but it was an interesting struggle because Portugal broke from England, broke from Spain, and established an independent monarchy. They had a joint monarchy. And Portugal had no money to fight Spain, which was the richest nation in the world. So in order for Portugal to get arms to fight Spain, they had to go to the Jewish community and the Dutch community and ask them for help to fight Spain. And they did. In Europe, they were partners fighting Spain. But then since the Dutch and the Jewish community wanted the Portuguese slaving empire, they were at war with the same Portuguese over the colonies outside of Europe. So they had this dichotomy and this interesting conflict of being allies in Europe against Spain, but fighting each other in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in Africa. So I'm saying if we don't understand all of these things going on, the Counter-Reformation, the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, which was heavily involved in what we call the 30 Years' War, 1612 to 1648. There's a 30 Years' War in Europe, thereabout. And that's the Catholics and the Protestants fighting. And if we don't clock that in, we don't see how Europe was in a devastating period where the Jews were leaving Eastern European nations as refugees and coming into Amsterdam. So Amsterdam by the 1650s was overloaded with refugees.
They migrated to Amsterdam because the king there was very happy to take them in because they represented a new amount of commerce for the Dutch.
So when the Portuguese finally regained Brazil in 1654, fleets of ships left, and at one point 16 ships left with the Jews of Brazil who had been slaving, and they brought them to Amsterdam. 14 ships came to Amsterdam, 2 ships went to the Caribbean. And when the 14 ships with a couple thousand Jews came into Amsterdam, on top of the thousands of Jews that had come from the 30 Years' War, that was an overload of the Amsterdam Jewish community. So in response to that, they fed the people who came from Brazil with a kosher meal, gave them a bath and another set of clothing, and then sent them out to establish colonies of sugar and slaves in the Caribbean.
And Jewish leaders all over the Atlantic world, Portuguese Jewish leaders, they engaged in a network of mobility management. And they typically, when there was a new arrival who was impoverished, a Jew, they would typically give them money in order to sustain themselves and then try to encourage that person to make their way to another colony or to the metropole. The sooner the better, the further away the better.
So I have what I'm developing called the 13 colonies. And most of us, because of our limited knowledge, think of the 13 colonies in North America. I'm not talking about that. At the same time that the North American U.S. colonies were being developed, the 13 colonies. There were 13 Jewish colonies being developed in the Caribbean and South America. So that history needs to be tied together. That Fort Amsterdam, which was the first British enslavement center along the coast of Africa from 1631 to 1665. But when the Second Anglo-Dutch War, when the Dutch and the English started fighting each other, and the war was settled, the Dutch gave up New Amsterdam, and it became New York. And the British said you can have Suriname, and it became the leading Dutch slaving colony. But at the same time, Fort Amsterdam in 1665 moved from English hands to Dutch hands. So the Dutch now had another base on the African coast. They had Fort Amsterdam linked to not New Amsterdam, because that's now English, but Suriname, which is the New Netherlands. So you have to see a triangle link between Amsterdam in Europe, Fort Amsterdam on the west coast of Africa, and New Holland, New Netherlands in South America, Suriname. Then when you see that triangle, you can understand what the system was all about. But if you don't see the triangle, you're talking about African villages or Africans enslaving Africans, then you don't see the slave system that we know that perpetuated itself for 400 years, with Europeans making profits, fitting out the ships in Europe, leaving the ports of Europe, first the Spanish and Portuguese ports of Seville and Oporto and Lisbon, coming to Africa, then from the French ports of Nantes, Bordeaux, and Marseille, and Rochelle, going to Africa, and then coming from the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, Zeeland and The Hague, then coming from the German ports of Hamburg and Copenhagen's Danish ports, then coming from the English ports of London, Liverpool, and Bristol. All of that, fitting out of ships, making a profit, with poor manufactured goods on the ships, going to the coast of Africa, trading these poor goods for gold and Africans, and then taking the captive Africans to the New World, and then working them to death on the plantations, then making a profit, then taking the profit from the slave activity back to Europe, making another profit.
First of all, we have to center slavery when we're dealing with any Atlantic Jewish community. So the involuntary transport of millions of people from West Africa was absolutely central to the economy, to many of the discrete economies of the Americas and in general of the Atlantic world. The slave society is a society whose economy is heavily based on free labor. And were the enslaved people suddenly to disappear because they were massacred or liberated from slavery or expelled, the colony would economically collapse. The entire economy of the colony would collapse. And historians agree that, most historians agree that for a society to qualify as a slave society, about 1/3 of the population needs to be enslaved. In Suriname, which is overqualified for the slave society label, well over 90% of the population was enslaved by the mid to late 18th century.
So this four-way profit system is what was the motor that moved enslavement, not Africans selling Africans or Africans bringing Africans down to the coast. European is at the center of it. The Pope blessed it. Every ship that left was blessed by either a Catholic priest or a Protestant minister. So they claimed they were doing the work of God. So there's something devilish about that. There's something devilish about even the concept that you're going to destroy somebody's humanity and you're doing the work of God. But see, they had read black people out of the human family. And so they could justify it in their minds and in their biblical traditions that we were not worthy of being treated better than the mules and the ox and the horse and whatever. In enslavement.
So in one case, Morris Raffal in New York wrote a very famous piece, an editorial, where he defended slavery because, after all, the Bible endorses slavery, and the Bible actually sets out very clear parameters by which a Jew should own slaves, or how a Jew should own slaves. Since he was trying to justify owning slaves, African slaves, because they were a lesser species.
So that's why I say we need to see the slave system and not just slavery. And even when we see slavery, we need to see it as its European roots established it, and not as we perceive it.
See, Europeans have said we're slaves. They say slaves out of Africa. They don't say captives out of Africa. When people were taken from their village and brought down here, they weren't slaves. They were captives. That's why they had them in chains. There's no plantations for them to work here. When they were sold into enslavement in the so-called New World, then that's when the serious enslavement process takes place that we know of. And what I do is establish 1482 to 1536 as the 50-year turning point of history. Before that time, Europe was land poor, resource poor, people poor. But after 1482, Europe began to move out of its icebox and try to get around the Islamic world that controlled the Mediterranean to get over to Asia. And so the Portuguese start sailing down the coast of Africa. They're afraid to go way out into the sea, into the ocean, because they may fall off. So they stay near the coast, and they discover Morocco, and then they discover Senegal, then they discover the Gambia, then they discover Sierra Leone, then they go down the coast here to Ghana, then they go down to Dahomey, then to Nigeria, all the way down to Angola in the 1440s. And then they come back here in the 1482 because this was the best base with this rock called Elmina, and with the river and the bay. It was a relatively protected harbor, so they saw that as the place where they could establish their base and continue their explorations and continue to slave their trading of enslaved Africans and gold. And then Columbus, who they say was here in 1482, found out about traveling west over the ocean and going east and getting to the east. And so he came up with the idea of going east. And so he tried to float it in Spain and other places, and it didn't float. But then 1492, January, Grenada fell, the last Muslim stronghold, Moorish stronghold. And that meant that the Catholics were victorious in their war against the Moors after hundreds of years. But it also meant that the Catholics, now in power, with the help of Jews who switched from the Islam Moors to the Catholics, now the Catholics decided they were going to victimize the Jews. So by March they declared that all Jews who had converted to Christianity and were backsliding had to leave Spain. And they gave them a certain period to get their act together to become true Christians, otherwise they had to leave. Then they decided that the Jews who were allowed to be Jews in Spain that had not converted were too much of a temptation for the Jews that had converted, so they said, we think you guys better get out too. So here the Jewish community that's well established in Spain and Portugal now had to leave. Now here comes Columbus with his idea about sailing west. And so nobody would buy it. But these Jews, knowing that they're being pushed out of Spain, said, wait a minute, let's look at it. Because if there's something on the other side, maybe that's where we can go when we're kicked out. So the converted Jews of Spain funded Columbus. So we learn a little myth that Columbus's voyage was funded by Queen Isabella's jewels, when in point of fact, Columbus's voyage was funded by Queen Isabella's Jews. And their names are historically recorded: Sant'Angelo and Abernal. They were the treasurers for the money people around the throne of Ferdinand and Isabel. And these were the people that Columbus signed his contract with. So by August, these people had to get out of Spain. And that's when Columbus set sail. And he did take some converted Jews with him, but he was financed by them. And when he sighted land and he reported back to Spain, he reported back to them. In fact, Columbus kept two journals, one for the Spanish throne and one which was the real deal, which was the Jewish financiers that financed him.
The story of the slaves in America begins with Christopher Columbus. His voyage to America was not financed by Queen Isabella, but by Louis de Santiago, who advanced the sum of 17,000 ducats, about 5,000 pounds today, equal to 50,000 pounds, to finance the voyage, which began on August 3rd, 1492. Columbus was accompanied by 5 Marranos, Jews who had forsworn their religion and supposedly became Catholics. Louis de Torre, interpreter, Marco, the surgeon, Bamal, the physician, Alonso de la Calle, and Gabriel Sanchez.
So the history has not been told, but it's there. So from the very beginning, because Columbus is the first enslaver, the Jewish community of wealth was involved with the enslavement process in Spain and Portugal, and then they continued in the Protestant nations of the Dutch and the English. And so their involvement spans the whole spectrum of enslavement. So if you want to see a thread that links things together, it's good to follow the rich Jewish involvement in the slave system, and then you can see all the parameters.
Virtually the only place that you read about Jews in Atlantic historiography is when you're reading about conversos, who were transatlantic merchants, inter-imperial merchants, and reading about the powerhouse, the powerhouse of the economy that Portuguese Jews were able to create by virtue of their links.
The leading members of the Jewish community were involved in the management of finances, the laws that control the movement of economics and politics, and the health of the rich people who needed physicians. So around the emperors and the princes and whatnot were these people who in Spain were called the grandees. In Eastern Europe they were called the court Jews. And so these were people who managed the wealth and the power, Jewish people who managed it for Europeans. So that's a part of the mix. That Jews, rich Jews, were in strategic positions because of the way the Catholic Church had prevented them from owning property, prevented them from getting into certain fields. So the Jews had to invent a new type of money because they were constantly being victimized by people who didn't like Jews.
The expulsion of Jews by European governments was not unusual, with most of the complaints centered around economic exploitation, monopolizing, or quote-unquote sharp practice. By 1500, with the exception of certain parts of Italy, Western Europe had closed its doors to Jewish people.
Because in the history of the Middle Ages, the Jews would run out of every European country. And many cities had laws that they could not come in those cities. Cities like Vienna and Frankfurt and whatnot. These were free cities who could make their own rules, and they kept the Jews out because they didn't want them competing as merchants. And so many princes wanted to control, or emperors wanted to control these free cities. And in order to control them, they used the Jewish commercial and money people to try to mess with these free cities, so they would allow them to set up trading towns around the free cities. So there's a conflict between the free cities like Copenhagen and Hamburg and Frankfurt and Vienna and the Jewish community, and the emperors and the princes were allowing them to fund them in order to fight the city. So there's a whole another struggle in Europe that's not known unless you know European history. So to be very frank, we can't understand the enslavement system unless we have mastered European history. And most of us say, well, I don't want to deal with no European history. I'm African-centered. Well, you ain't really African-centered if you can't put Europe in the equation. I don't want to do nothing. I'm dealing with Africa. I want to deal with Americas. Well, if you can't put the Native Americans and what happened to them in the equation, you can't understand why the Africans were at the center of things. So I don't want to deal with no Arabs. I'm going to deal with African-centeredness. Well, if you don't deal with Arabs and Islam, then you can't understand what the relationship of Islam and the Moors and Europe was, and the relationship of the Mediterranean, why the Europeans were trying to get around the Mediterranean in order to get to Asia because of the control of the Mediterranean by people who are Islamic. So if you don't have a world perspective, then you can't even understand your African center. The big economic pie, though, is in the Caribbean, because sugar is now moving in the Caribbean. It's moved in by Dutch Jews.
The Jews of Suriname, and arguably in the Atlantic world in general, did not see their exile as a punishment, but rather they saw it as an opportunity to forge these new frontier communities, which by virtue of being frontier communities afforded Jews the potential for garnering an array of privileges and economic opportunities.
They took Brazil in the 1630s, and they worked Brazil as the sugar plum of the European world. And a lot of money was made on sugar.
The Jews of Brazil resided in Recife, the port of Jews, with Dutch and their fortune in the sugar and slave trades.
In fact, in Brazil, it said on a Jewish holiday, no slaves could be bought or sold because it was a holiday. So what does that tell you about slavery in Brazil? 80 million of us down there. They didn't come there on no free ship looking for something. They were brought there as slaves.
They sold African slaves to the sugar plantation owners and owned 10 of the best sugar plantations. They sent their production back to Holland to be refined by the Jewish merchants. That's how sugar came to the old world from the new world. But here's the thing. They were the first slave traders. They brought the slaves from Africa to South America.
So they could take the cover off of being converted and function as Jews. So this is an important point, because one of the criticisms of myself and others is that you say that the Jews were involved in slavery because they were Jews, but the few that were involved in slavery were just merchants. When in point of fact, that might seem to be the case, but when you look deeper and analyze it, the Jewish involvement in slavery was tied in because they were Jews. Their involvement in slavery meant that they could negotiate a freer Jewish community in the European nations. And if they offered to help with slavery, they could negotiate a contract to have a free community and to have privileges and restrictions removed. And that's what they did.
Jews had power as pioneers, so to speak, as among the initial European settlers of the region, and they could negotiate. They were in a position of power that allowed them to negotiate for an array of privileges that the colonial authorities would bestow upon them. And I've already mentioned a couple of those privileges. They did include, most prominently, communal autonomy, the right to exist as a government within a government, but they also had many other perks as well. And in fact, what I found in Suriname is the privileges accumulated over time, whereas in other parts of the world, the privileges given to Jews could retract, could be rescinded and then given back and retracted.
Many of these Dutch colonists in northern Brazil consisted of Sephardic Jews. These planters and businessmen and their families had immigrated originally from Spain and Portugal to Holland to avoid religious persecution at the onset of the infamous Spanish Inquisition.
Jews in Brazil became active plantation owners, importers of African labor, and providers of capital. And also, they provided a massive trading network.
Eventually, the Spanish Inquisition reached these colonies in the New World. And these Sephardic Jews in Brazil began looking for a new place to settle that accepted their ideology and offered the potential for monetary growth. Their first stop upon their exodus was Barbados. Although not afforded the privileges they had established in Brazil, these transplants brought with them a valuable knowledge of the production of a commodity that had only just recently become a highly demanded staple throughout Europe, a product that would literally transform the economic and cultural landscape of the island of Barbados, making the whole venture an overwhelming success. Sugar.
It was a fortunate transfer of technology from Brazil to Barbados in the middle of the 17th century.
It was the Sephardic Jews that brought windmill technology, the knowledge of sugarcane cultivation, and that formed the very basis of the great wealth that was to become Barbados. It transformed the world economy, and Barbados was at the epicenter of that transformation.
That they started bringing in enslaved Africans from the West Coast en masse.
The traders are sourcing enslaved Africans from different parts of Western Africa, places like Ghana, Nigeria. There is evidence that some would have come even from East Africa. The treatment could not have been good. Slave ships were at sea for many, many weeks, a couple of months. People were in very cramped conditions. Of course, on the slave ship, people would have been chained down. Very bad conditions, obviously.
Africans begin their existence here having their culture identified as inferior, subhuman. So it's an extremely desperate situation for the African who comes to Barbados.
So they brought in shiploads and shiploads of Africans from West Africa.
And the beautiful thing is, it's all in documents. It's all written. There's no oral tradition. There's no storytelling. It's written documents there for the world to see. In their own words. In their own language. And that's how the 13 colonies emerge. The first major colony is Brazil. But they lose that in 1654. But they started losing it in the 1640s. They finally lost it in 1654 when the 14 ships had to leave. And then as a result of that, the Jewish community that went from Brazil to Amsterdam was sent out to colonize the Caribbean. And what were the colonies? Among the first colonies outside of Brazil was Curacao. So there are 3 Jewish colonial schemes for Curacao. One in 1651, one in 1652, another in 1659. The one in 1651 and 1652 didn't work because they were attempting to establish agricultural settlements to work sugar. But Curacao is not a land-based island. Curacao is a sandbar off of the coast of northern South America. So you can't grow anything in sand. So that didn't work. So they began to smuggle things into the slave system of the Spanish. And so when they came back in 1659, they came back to do business. And from that point on, Curacao becomes the Amsterdam of the Caribbean as the leading center for enslavement and trading slave products. At the height of Curacao, let's say about 1700, half of Curaçao's population was Jewish. And half of the 4,000 Jews in the Caribbean were in the little island of Curacao. So you see how important it became. But the real wealth for sugar comes not from Curacao, but comes from the 3 colonies in Suriname. And so those 3 colonies became Barbice, Demerara, and Essequibo. I can't pronounce it properly, but that's the name. It sounds a little something like that. Those were 3 colonies, sugar colonies, that were planted in northern South America, where we call Suriname and Guyana. And one was planted in the French Guyane, which is French Guyana, at Remire, R-E-M-I-R-E. And so there were 3 in Suriname, 3 in Curacao, 1 in Tobago, 1 in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and several of the islands off of Aruba, and another little island, Saint Eustatius. So these were, most people don't realize that these sugar islands in the Caribbean were heavily influenced by the Jewish community because sugar was a technical specialty. Sugar is not just planting. Sugar is an industrial enterprise. Sugar involves certain secrets of how you process material. Sugar is highly intensive. You have to have you have to have the mill, and you have to have the water power, and you have to have the oxen, and you have to have a heavy manpower for the cane, and you have to have the exports and whatnot. And so capital intensive and high technology was in the hands of the Dutch and the Jews. And so they controlled sugar in the Caribbean. And the first sugar island in the Caribbean is the little island of Barbados. And the Jewish community from Brazil helped to transform Barbados in a period of 10 years. The British established Barbados. The Portuguese founded Barbados in the 1500s, but there was nothing there for them to worry about, so they preferred to have the mainland of Spain, of New Spain, Mexico, Peru, where you had gold mines and diamond, silver mines and all that business. So they just left Barbados. So it's rediscovered by the British in 1625 or 1627. And the British establish it with poor British farmers. Eventually 11,000 tobacco farmers are established in Barbados with small plots. But tobacco is not making money. This is the 1630s. Tobacco is not making money in Virginia and the North American colonies. So the savior is brought in, and that's sugar. And the Jewish community from Brazil brings in sugar. So within 10 years, from the 1630s to the 1640s, Barbados moves from 11,000 small proprietors to 900 sugar estates. And from that point on, Barbados becomes the jewel of the British Caribbean.
Sugarcane is actually a tropical grass. It grows well in areas that are not prone to excessive rainfall. It also must have a ripening season and reaped during a dry period to ensure the highest sucrose content. After it's harvested, a mill must be utilized, usually powered by wind or oxen. Cut cane would be fed into wooden rollers that squeeze and crush it, extracting a juice. This juice would be boiled down through a series of pots of varying sizes to a molten form of sugar. It is cooled in a final stage, and sugar crystals are formed. It was an elaborate process that required skill and many resources.
If you make a mistake, then you can spoil a whole sugar crop.
A successful sugar plantation on Barbados would have a minimum of 300 working enslaved peoples.
Sugar changed the landscape of Barbados. Sugar changed the demographic landscape of Barbados. Sugar changed the culture of Barbados. And sugar created a system.
And from the 1640s, 50s, and 60s, more wealth is produced in that little island of Barbados than all of the 13 colonies in North America.
Now, you said it went from 11,000.
11,000 small farmers trying to grow tobacco and not making economic headway to being consolidated into 900 sugar estates.
Okay, now I understand the relationship.
Okay. Now, what you also want to understand is how Jewish law, how British anti-Jewish law affects the Jewish involvement in slavery. So in order for the Jews to have labor in their businesses or their plantations, they had to have enslaved Africans. So once the 11,000 small proprietorships were failing and you were consolidating, those people who had lost their land or were bought out, these poor white farmers, could not become indentures on the sugar plantation.
Who they had as the labor force were indentured servants from Ireland and Scotland.
People regarded Irish almost as sort of like a different subhuman group of people whom it was okay to exploit and dehumanize.
So people from the British Isles who would have been brought to Barbados for a defined period of time, 5 to 7 years I believe was the time of the indentured period.
And plantations popped up everywhere. Some records say as many as 500 plantations on that small island.
They realized that they could indenture the poor white English servants, but they would lose them from yellow fever, and the Africans survived.
they found out that the indentured servants, they were not able to withstand the heat and what it would take to really make the plantations productive. It was at that point that they started bringing in enslaved Africans from the West Coast en masse.
So many of these white farmers left Barbados and went to South Carolina to try to start up slaving there. And many of them went to a wild pirate island inhabited by pirates and whores called Jamaica. And so they went to Jamaica. That was not desired by anybody because the terrain was so wild and the people were so inhospitable, meaning they were pirates and brigands and whatnot. And so many of these poor white people had nowhere to go. So they went to Jamaica and joined the whoring and the pirating. When the Dutch got kicked out of Brazil, a Jewish rabbi, Menashe ben Israel, was planning to go with 500 of his people to head the synagogue in Recife. But before he could do that, and his brother was already there, before he could do that, the synagogue left Brazil and came to Amsterdam because they had to evacuate. So the next year, 1655, Menashe ben Israel writes a famous letter to Cromwell. And it's in all the Jewish history books. But there's no context for the letter. And he's asking Cromwell to allow the Jews to come back into England after being kicked out for several hundred years. And Cromwell wants them to come back because he's the new leader of England. His power hasn't been fully consolidated, and he needs as much help as he can get. In the revolution, the Cromwellian revolution, they cut off the head of the king, etc., etc. And so this new force is controlling the English nation. Menashe ben Israel says, if you let us back into England, we can help you like we helped the Dutch. And right now you have this competition between the English and the Dutch. The English just passed the Navigation Acts to keep Dutch products out because they can't compete with the Dutch. So now you have a Jew from Amsterdam saying, we can help you financially like we did with the Dutch. So Cromwell wants to help. But the rich English people who don't want this competition say no. So the rich English people who control Parliament block a law from being passed to allow the Jews to come back. But Cromwell gets around that, just like Clinton works around the U.S. Congress, by saying, we don't need a law. You can come because there's no law keeping you out. No. English law is not written. So much of it is common law, so much of it is activity, so much of it is just habit, what people do, custom. And so he said, the custom has never been followed to keep you out. So come on in. But the agreement was only the wealthy can come in. And so, because we don't want the others getting afraid that you're going to move into the crafts and the guilds will be threatened, etc., there'll be a groundswell of opposition. So he fought off the rich by having the Jews help him establish either the Bank of England or the English Exchange. So within a few years of not being in England, the Jews now are in the center of the economic enterprise that's going to help to build the English economy. But here's the story of Cromwell. 1655, Cromwell, not even having control of the English nation, decides to have his grand design to take the Spanish Empire. My contention is that he couldn't even think of taking the Spanish Empire, funding a fleet to go to the New World, unless he had a source of wealth that had a history of funding these operations. And the only people who had a history of funding these operations, including the military operations, were the Jewish community. Because they could put the money package together, taking wealth from the different areas of Europe where the Jews are, and coming up with a quick money package.
Oliver Cromwell. They are good and useful spies. That's what he talked about us as Jews, okay? Of the Jews who advised him of the conquest of Jamaica, Jews from all over the New World shed their converso cloaks and moved to Jamaica. The community soon included ship owners from Mexico, Brazil, traders from Peru and Colombia, and ship captains and pilots from Nevis and the Barbados. Together, their knowledge of the New World trade was unsurpassed.
So with the Jewish money behind him, Cromwell came up with the grand design of taking the Spanish Empire, and the first base was to take Cuba. So the fleet was sent out to take Cuba, but they got their butts kicked. So the story about Menashe ben Israel and Cromwell is very significant, and it needs to be woven into the historical context of the systems analysis. And after the English fleet got its butt kicked off of Cuba, Cromwell told them not to come home without a prize. And the potential prize is this island of ruffians, pirates, and harlots called Jamaica. So the fleet was sent from its defeat in Cuba to take Jamaica. And it was easy to take because there was nobody there to defend it. Nobody wanted it. So he was able to take Jamaica. And so he could claim a victory.
Jews of Jamaica. At one point, 20% of Kingston's population were Jews of Portuguese Spanish ancestry. Okay? Spanish Town was founded by Jews who escaped Spain. The first Jews landed in the island in 1534. 1534. We were already in the Caribbean. The Jews, aided by the British conquest of the isle under the British, Port Royal, Jamaica was home to a large Jewish community. Jewish pirates of Jamaica named their ships for ancient Jewish heroes and prophets. The prophet Samuel, the Queen Esther, the shield of Abraham. Those are the names of their ships. And they targeted Spanish and Portuguese merchant ships. A number of the captains were ordained rabbis.
When you think of pirates, you probably think of rum-guzzling, treasure-hunting, eye-patch-wearing, yar-swearing bad boys of the high seas. But did you know that centuries before Johnny Depp suited up as Jack Sparrow, there were Jews who operated under the swaying Jolly Roger? Who were these Jewish pirates of the Caribbean? What motivated them? And what kind of semi-kosher mayhem did they get into? It all started in 1492, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain expelled 200,000 Jews. This purge of the Jews came from a Christian clerk who wanted to stop traditional Jews from influencing conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity. Oddly enough, the clerk himself had converso ancestors.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
But we guess that didn't stop them. A number of these exiled Spanish Jews decided to seek revenge from their anti-Semitic monarchs on the high seas. These long-bearded, sword-wielding, Spanish-speaking members of the tribe were like something out of an overblown Tarantino vengeance fantasy. There was even a pirate nicknamed the Great Jew. His actual name was Sinan Reyes, and he was second in command to the pirate Barbarossa, Italian for Redbeard, in the early 1500s. The duo attacked their fair share of Spanish merchant ships, but it wasn't all fun and games and bottles of kosher rum. In the early 1540s, the Great Jew's son was kidnapped at sea by King Charles V of Spain, and Redbeard recaptured the kidnapped boy in an epic series of attacks that included sacking a small Spanish town and blowing up a fort. Another Jewish pirate was Moses Cohen Henriquez, considered to be one of the most successful buccaneers ever. He was supposedly the brains behind one of the biggest pirate hauls in history, the 1628 capture of the Spanish Silver Fleet, a convoy of about 25 ships loaded with treasure returning from Spain's American colonies. Henriquez sailed with the Dutch West India Company admiral and low-key pirate Piet Hein. The silver and gold the duo lifted in the raid is estimated to be worth over $1 billion today. Not bad for a day's haul. Henriquez was a pretty wild guy too. He established his own pirate island, where he schlepped and hid his fortune, continued to advise Hein, and sailed the seven seas, eluding capture for the rest of his days. Other Jewish pirates were less tethered to the bad boy life. Yaakov Curiel, aka Diego Perez de Costa, was a converso Jew who commanded 3 pirate ships in the Caribbean seas, and spent a good decade or so pillaging unsuspecting Spanish vessels. And then, he found God. He repented for his marauding ways, became the first ever Baal Teshuvah pirate. Eventually, he made his way to the land of Israel, where he settled in Safed, a city in the Galilee, after becoming enthralled with the mystical teachings of Rabbi Isaac Luria, or the Arizal, the father of contemporary Kabbalah. Then there was the man known as the Pirate Rabbi, who terrorized the seafaring Spanish in the late 1500s, using part of his loot to found a community of Sephardic Jews in Amsterdam. The Pirate Rabbi supposedly kept kosher on the high seas, and may have even brought a chef along with him to make sure he wasn't eating treif. Jewish pirates tended to form partnerships with leading non-Jewish pirates of the day. This often led to remarkable crossovers of Jewish and pirate culture, including treasure maps written in Hebrew, ships with names like the Queen Esther and the Shield of Abraham, and tombstones in Jamaican Jewish cemeteries that bore the skull and crossbones. These sea-bound raiders fought for decades against the Spanish, attacking ships and sharing Spanish naval secrets with Spain's enemies, all while building up a mercantile network connecting trading posts around the globe. Some scholars shy away from using the term Jewish pirates, since a lot of the aforementioned people served in advisory roles to other leading pirates. But if we broaden the term to include buccaneers, smugglers, privateers, or, in Spanish, contrabandistas, there's a broad consensus that Jews at the time were involved in illegal trade and raid against the Spanish Empire. Maybe what we actually call them is not as important as just recognizing that they existed at all, and recognizing that the Jewish role in early mid-second millennia Caribbean maritime history was greater than we thought. These Jewish naval greats had profound influence on leading pirates at the time, and took their fate into their own hands, and many succeeded, which makes for some pretty thrilling stories of vengeance and self-determination.
Jewish pirates. They were privateers. They had matured from being pirates to business people. Okay, it was no longer fashionable to be a pirate. You associated yourself with a country, they paid you money to attack other countries on their behalf, and you were a privateer. You weren't in their navy, you were an independent contractor. Okay? Huh? Halliburton, right. So this is the birth of Jewish entrepreneurism. And the Dutch were not known for having a big navy, so they hired a navy. They hired the Jewish pirates.
1660, you have another Anglo-Dutch War, 1665, 65. The English win this war. So New Amsterdam, which was established in 1623, when the Dutch were expanding the system of enslavement, and they did it by establishing in 1621 the Dutch West Indian Company. New Amsterdam, which was just established in 1623, and then they brought Africans in 1626. New Amsterdam is given to the Dutch, and it's named after the Duke of York, who eventually becomes the King of England. And so it becomes New York. And then the English give the Dutch Suriname, full control of Suriname. So Suriname now consolidates the three Jewish colonies into one grand colony. And they are located on what is called the Jordan Savannah, the Jewish Savannah. It's like a separate Jewish nation with 115, eventually 115 slave plantations with tens of thousands of Africans.
Jordan Savannah, the Jewish village that Portuguese Jews established on the edge of the Surinamese rainforest, was a proto-Zionist utopia.
They're separate military and everything. And they become infamous in African history because not only were they enslaving Africans, but they put a military in place to go to war against the Bush Negro republics of escaped Africans who went into the bush and established independence.
The Jewish colony of Suriname was described as utopian, and special attention was always given to this village that Jews established in the middle of the rainforest. And they established houses and plantations that surrounded the village, primarily sugar plantations, but also cocoa, coffee, and cotton plantations. So this village was touted over and over again in the sources as a utopian village, as a place where Jews had established a Zionistic settlement, where there was an ingathering of the Jewish exiles, where Jews had self-rule, where they did not suffer from oppression, where there was economic prosperity. I found out that Jordan Savannah was constantly under siege, not only by enslaved Africans who threatened and sometimes actually did rebel and invade the village and try to attack the synagogue. But also, the Jewish community was under threat by itself, because many of the citizens of the community did not like the leadership, did not like the Portuguese Jewish leadership, for various reasons, not always stated, and they were constantly staging their own rebellions. But there were many non-Jewish observers who said, wow, this village is very unusual. It's the only village in the whole world where only Jews lived. So I did see that repeated over and over. And even there, I found that that was not the case, because if you count the enslaved Africans that were resident either temporarily or year-round in the village and who were responsible for the physical upkeep of the village, then arguably the dominant group living in Yoden Savannah was not Jewish at all.
There's a whole history of the Jewish militias fighting against these African peoples. But an interesting episode in 1667 occurred when a group of Jews wanted to leave the Dutch control Suriname and go to Jamaica. 13 Jewish families with hundreds of Africans enslaved were asking permission to leave, and the Dutch governor of Suriname said, no, you're too valuable, I can't afford to leave you, let you leave. So there's a historical struggle from 1667 to 1676, 10 years, of these people fighting to get out of Suriname and to go to Jamaica. And eventually they do. And when they do, from the 1670s on, Jamaica kicks in as a replacement for Barbados as the sugar island. By 1703, because of marriage, France has the Asiento. By 1713, after war between France and England over the Spanish throne, the War of the Spanish Succession, England gets the Asiento, and that signals, that's the Treaty of Utrecht, and that signals the English beginning control and domination over the slave trade. So in the 1700s, the English dominated the slave trade. In the 1800s, the Dutch took it and dominated it. And the English fought 4 wars to get it from the Dutch, and eventually they're successful. At the end of the 1600s, the Dutch are so successful that they even control the Asiento, which is most unusual. And at a period of time, the Jews controlled it through the Dutch. And also in that period of time, the 1660s, Jewish money from Spain and Portugal left wholesale and came to Amsterdam. Whole families with fortunes left and went to Amsterdam and Hamburg. And so you see the Jewish money drain. And what they did was they created for almost 100 years the golden age of the Dutch. And that becomes their golden age. The artists, the great works of the great artists in Amsterdam, Van Gogh and all the rest of them, and the great portraits that they produced. In fact, Rembrandt produced a portrait of a Jewish patriarch, one of his famous paintings. And so this was the period of great wealth. But what was that wealth based upon? It was mainly based upon the slave and system that the Dutch and the Jewish partners were able to get control of. So you can see why they want to hide the history, because we consider the Dutch very decent people who grow tulips and wear wood shoes and push windmills, and when they turned out to be the most vicious enslavers of them all.
So they go from being pirates to being established people of a congregation, okay? They forget we were pirates. That was over there. This is here. We'll grow tulips. Things will be good.
And the link with the English needs to be understood, as well as the link with the Spanish. I had mentioned before that Queen Elizabeth may have had some serious Jewish funding, or Huguenot Dutch, or Huguenot, French Huguenot Protestant funding. But in the 1680s 60s, there was serious Dutch Jewish funding of the English throne. Cromwell first, and that helped him with his grand design, 1655. And then there was a conflict in the English throne. The House of Orange in Holland married into the English throne. And so William of Orange was helping his wife claim the English throne. And so William III invaded England in 1688. The funding for William III's expedition was largely from the Jewish community. So from that point on, the Jewish community is in England through the highest level, the king himself. And so unless you can see these things and understand these things, you really can't make an analysis of what the system of enslavement was all about. But for me, it's a fantastic story.
Yes, indeed.
And but we're going to have difficulty when we raise the 13 Jewish sugar colonies. I count the sugar colonies from 1630 in Brazil to 1733 in America. So I'm not even sure whether I want to include the American colony, but I just may, just to give myself continuity. That American colony was Savannah, Georgia. Georgia was established in the 1730s as a non-slave colony. A colony that would be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the English colonies, and to prevent enslaved peoples from running off and joining the Native Americans and Seminoles and whatnot and escaping to Spanish Florida. So they wanted a free colony, and that was a humanitarian, Oglethorpe, who conceived of the idea, and they took white people, non-Jewish people, to Georgia to settle. And they did. And lo and behold, here comes a group of 44 or more Jews who were not invited. They didn't go through Oglethorpe's system. They made a special arrangement through the Bank of England or whatever. But here they arrive in Savannah.
And in 1733, 42 Jews, including Dr. Nunez, came to Savannah. When they arrived, the Georgia colony was only a few months old. What's more, the Jews got there just in time.
But the white folks, after trying to make it, it becomes clear to them that they can't make it without Africans. So even though they came to a so-called non-slave experiment, they start petitioning to bring in enslaved Africans. And the Jews want to join the petition, and they tell the Jews, we don't want you to join our petition. So they put their own petition in. So when the colonies were not given their petition for enslavement, many of the Jews who came to Savannah to enslave Africans and be a part of the slave system left and went to Charleston, where there was an establishment enslavement, and they helped develop Charleston as the largest Jewish community in America.
Interestingly enough, despite the prominence of Jews in this African slave trade in this country, in the US of A, their prominence in the African slave trade was not matched by a similar prominence in the abolitionist movement. In fact, some of the Christian abolitionists noted this apparent contradiction. In fact, let me quote you here a very interesting statement put out by Christian abolitionists. This is 1853. It's from the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society Report, 1853. Quote, "The Jews of the United States have never taken any steps, whatever, with regard to the slavery question. As citizens, they deem it their policy to have everyone choose whichever side he may deem best to promote his own interests and the welfare of his country, etc., etc., etc. This statement concludes as follows, quote, "The objects of so much mean prejudice and unrighteous oppression as the Jews have been for ages, surely they, it would seem, more than any other denomination, ought to be the enemies of caste and friends of universal freedom." Such, however, was not the case. There were very few and far between as far as the abolitionist movement was concerned.
It's very frustrating, but there is almost nothing in the rabbinical sources that speaks directly to the system of slavery in Jewish communities of the Atlantic world. There is no evidence in any Jewish sources of abolition, that the rabbis were abolitionists, that they condemned slavery, not at all. This was actually part of the world. It was part of the economy, and it was part of the background, and no rabbi, to my knowledge, ever questioned this until the rise of abolitionism in the 19th century.
Yeah. One thing that nobody was an abolitionist.
Oh, really?
And that is because the abolitionism, the supporters of abolitionism in America had a very anti-Jewish rhetoric associated with their cause.
Even Quakers did?
Yeah, it's true. And William Lloyd Garrison also had said some quite hostile things towards the Jews.
At the back of this book, from the Jewish Encyclopedia, quote, "The cotton plantations in many parts of the South were wholly in the hands of the Jews, and as a consequence, slavery found its advocates among them." This little book that's on sale tonight shows you how they sold us. It wasn't just Gentiles. No, no, no. These were the people.
There's been a big debate that has arisen concerning, whether Jews were the dominant element or not, or whether they were even an important element. But much of that discussion has taken place in the context of the United States of America. In the U.S., it may not be correct to say that Jews were as dominant in the slave trade as they were in parts of, say, the Caribbean or Central America. Nevertheless, Jews were an important part of the slave trade in this country, in the U.S. of A. Anyway.
Any Jew who was in business was almost guaranteed in the southern towns to have dealings with slaves in one way or another. As storekeepers, they either sold to slaves or they sold to slave owners. Auctioneers always had dealings with slaves or in slaves, and commission merchants acting for plantation owners had a great deal to do with the slave system.
In fact, in the U.S. of A., Jews apparently played a role in the slave trade that was greater than the numbers in the overall population would suggest, even though their numbers may have been relatively small. And many of the people who have tried to refute, the suggestion that Jews were prominently involved in the slave trade in this country, many of those people have put forward figures suggesting that Jews were only a very minute portion of the overall American population. Yes, they were a very small percentage of the American population, but that has nothing to do with their role in the slave trade, the importance of their role. Their role was much greater than their numbers in the overall population would suggest. As a matter of fact, a Jewish historian has done a study of the 1830 census in the South and has come up with the conclusion that something like 75% of Jewish households in the South, in this country, in 1830, owned slaves, whereas the percentage for white households generally was only something like 36%. So the Jews were approximately twice as likely as non-Jews, as the white population, to own slaves in this country, in the South, in 1830. So again, we're talking here about, proportions rather than absolute figures.
It has to be stated without any attempt to cover up that leaders of Jewish communities participated in the slave system without apology. You can take it, in other words, as fact that most Jews prior to the Civil War in the South, most Jews in the North, prior to the spread of the emancipation movement, accepted slavery as the natural course of the events.
Brothers and sisters, the horror of the transatlantic slave trade and how the South became the leader in production of cotton, and the Delta in Mississippi was the greatest cotton producing part of Earth on the planet. Look at this. Black folk picking cotton. Listen good now. Cotton was then what oil is now. The largest producer of oil in the world are the rich ones, and the strategic interests of America means in order for them to rule, they have to link with where the oil is coming from and take it or maneuver to get it, but they must have oil. In the time of slavery, it was cotton. And it's interesting that the cotton would come down the Mississippi, New Orleans to the Gulf, from Biloxi, Mississippi, and from Mobile, Alabama. And the cotton would come down and go up to New York, where the brethren of the Jewish people in the South, in the North, were the masters of the needle trades. And they had their brothers also in the South taking the lint from the cotton and producing cloth through weaving. But these were Jewish people owning the land. They were the majority. They were the merchants. They were the traders. They knew how to hook up with their brethren in the North. And they would send raw cotton to the mills in England, in Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol, and the British would turn it into cloth and then sell it all over the world. So from cotton, the South became rich. From cotton, it fueled the Industrial Revolution in the North. From cotton, the Rothschilds became rich. From cotton, the Lehman Brothers became rich from cotton in Alabama, then moved to New York and Wall Street. I know the truth, and somebody gotta tell it or die trying. Put up the areas where the cotton was produced. Put it up. Now this is cotton. North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. You see all these heavy black dots? Can you see them black dots? Those black dots represent Jewish bank owners and founders. Now look at the dots. These heavy dots, Jewish banks. And you notice this dark spot here, that's the Mississippi Delta.
So this then is the reality of Jewish involvement in the slave trade. And that's the reality that I faced then in 1993 when I stumbled into this controversy simply by exposing my students to the fact that Jews, like everybody else, had been involved. And of course, I did not deny the involvement of anybody else. I did not even deny the involvement of African collaborators. You know, and for years I had taught Christian involvement. And up to now, I'm still somewhat surprised that everybody else, you know, seems willing to acknowledge their involvement in the trade. But for some reason, this is the only group that not only refuses to acknowledge their involvement, but becomes very, 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 very upset when that involvement is mentioned.
Farrakhan live? No! Should he be in the United States? No! He belongs where? Libya!
Mordecai Levy, leader of New York City's Jewish Defense Organization, arrived in Pittsburgh the day before Minister Farrakhan's scheduled appearance. Although he seemingly attracted limited support, his street corner demonstration exemplified the anger and fear often associated with appearances by Louis Farrakhan.
Mr. Farrakhan, why do you think people are so afraid of you?
Truth makes those who are guilty of having deceived the people feel uneasy because they know the truth uncovers a lie and destroys it. Again, there are those who have always feared that someone would come along that black folk would really listen to, that they didn't control, and that would mean possibly the unification of the masses of black people, and this some fear as a sign of the end of their power and authority over our lives.
So there's so many books coming out now that we've raised the question of enslavement that I laugh when they come out. One came out called The Slave Trade by someone called Hugh Thomas. It's this thick, and it deals with a serious analysis of slavery. And he starts out in it by saying that Minister Farrakhan and others had said that Jews were involved in slavery, but he was only able to find 2 Jews involved in slavery. And I saw him on TV saying that Jeffries and Farrakhan had said something, and he could only find 2 Jews involved in slavery.
Yes, and of course it's a legitimate area of inquiry, and it is an inquiry that Eli Faber took up. Eli Faber, of course, took up the inquiry because of what the Nation of Islam was saying about how Jews dominated the slave trade and were the cruelest of slave owners. By the way, that's a trope that goes back to the historical sources, you can see. But Eli Faber has written a very important book on this, and that was exactly the question that he asked. To what extent were Jews involved in the slave trade? And he focused mostly on the British Caribbean, the British Atlantic world.
Now what they do is they say the Anglo-Saxon slave system. But there's no Anglo-Saxon slave system. It was a European international slave system. So if you're going to just chop off a piece of it, call it the Anglo-Saxon slave system, and not find any Jews in there, then that's your attempt to distort the perspective. England didn't allow Jews in England. So if there are not many Jews involved in the Anglo-Saxon slave system, it's because they were anti-Semitic, and they prevented the Jews from coming in England. They chased the Jews out of England in 1290 AD, and they didn't let them back in until 1655, when the letter was written from Amsterdam by Rabbi Menashe ben Israel to allow the Jews back into England. By then the slave system is already expansive and growing, and the Jews are not in England because they've been kept out. So if you want to understand the Jewish involvement in enslavement, you got to go across the English Channel to Amsterdam, to Holland, and then you'll see the heavy involvement in enslavement. And these people know that. So for them to focus on the Anglo-Saxon end of the deal means that they're hiding the truth. Now there's a new book that came out called Jews, Slaves, and the Slave Trade by someone called Faber, F-A-B-E-R. And it's called The Definitive Answer, Straightening Out the Record. And the record that needs to be straightened out because some professors, like a professor at City College, who was the head of African Studies, said some Jews were involved in slave trade. Now this is a professor from the university system that I was a part of that can't even mention my name. There's no professor at City College, it's me, okay, and everybody knows who it is. And he never contacted me to say, well, Dr. Jeffries, I know you have this claim to fame that you said Jews were involved in slavery, and could you clarify that or give me the source of your information? He never contacted me. I never met the man. But then when I read his book, the first few pages, he mentions that there was a significant involvement of Jewish peoples in the Dutch slave trade, And then he quickly passes over that and goes into the English slave trade and leaves the Dutch slave trade alone. And instead of saying that our initial work should be on the English slaving, but if we really wanted a comparison, let's compare Jewish involvement with the Dutch compared to Jewish involvement with the English. That's a scientist and a scholar would have done that. But you can't do that because their involvement with the Dutch is so enmeshed that the real deal is told. And so you just hide it. But it's going to emerge. My whole approach is truth crushed earth will rise again stronger than before. And so as the truth emerges, it's going to be more difficult to hide it.
They filtered into positions in education where they could control the curricula, which is the control of the mind. This is the heart and soul of the viciousness of what Zionism has done. You've got Holocaust curriculums mandated. Our children now must write essays on the Holocaust and dare not study the history of slavery. And you've got teachers who will not teach African history and can get away with it because the union is not going to do anything about it. Right. Someone took exception to me referring to a Jewish academic mafia. There is a Jewish academic mafia. And people are afraid of that academic mafia. I encountered that just today. We were supposed to go with our brothers and discuss Zionism, its history, its mechanics. And some of our brothers decided that maybe the subject is a little too delicate. So we had to come here in the slave theater and talk about it.
It's not a little lightweight book. It's 400 and some pages. Scholarship that they can't refute. How many of you have heard of the Holocaust? Raise your hand. How many of you have in school learned about the Holocaust? Raise your hand. Thank you. How many of you have seen on television movies about what happened to the Jewish people under Hitler and the Third Reich? Raise your hand. What about you? Here's a book that should be in every classroom. Here's a book that should be in every college. Here's a book that should inspire dialogue, because most white people don't know what happened to us. They just see a crazy acting people. But you know what happened to them. Why shouldn't you and they know what happened to us and what some of them did to put us in this condition? So we are going to force it. You know, you want Black History Month. Well, hell, what do you know about your history? If you don't know this, you are weak.
We have a duty also to let the world know that there was another Holocaust which gives its truest definition, the Black Holocaust.
Surely it just denigrates your own case to turn hatred on the Jews.
White Christians, the Catholics have all admitted their role in our oppression, But the ones who have consistently denied and kept secret their role was the Jewish people. Now the secret relationship is being revealed.
We read the inscription on the wall of the Hall of Remembrance of the Jewish Holocaust Memorial. And let these words be imprinted on our hearts and in our minds here tonight. Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and lest these things depart your heart all the days of your life. And you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. I say the same for what you have heard and seen and will see here tonight. These esteemed scholars who have come before me, they have busted the statistics and dropped the realistics, and now I'm going to kick the ballistics. We set forth here tonight that the Black Holocaust is 100 times worse than the so-called Jew Holocaust. Why do we even need to make a comparison? Because it was the old no-good President Buck-Tooth Jimmy Carter who stepped out and stepped forward when they were beginning to prepare to build the Jewish Holocaust Memorial. It was Jimmy Carter who said that it was the most unspeakable crime in the history of all time. He made a statement of comparison. When we deal with General David Eisenhower, General David Eisenhower made similar statements that we read and we saw on the walls of the Jewish Holocaust Memorial yesterday, making the world to believe that this was the most overpowering crime and atrocity against humankind in the history of all times. Everyone has come and said that it is the worst Holocaust that has ever existed, but all of a sudden when we come out on you, you now back down and claim that you never made a comparison. Well, tonight I'm going to make a comparison. We're going to lay the case out and see which Holocaust is the most dreadful, which Holocaust is the most vicious and bestial Holocaust, most bloody Holocaust ever recorded in the annals of time. But you want to deny us because you owe us reparations and you don't want to pay up today. The so-called Jew Holocaust lasted, you with me? Because I got to drop this stuff tonight because I'm a truth terrorist. I'm a knowledge gangster. I'm a black history hitman. I'm a lie killer, urban guerrilla. I got to be a roughneck. Got to be a roughneck. It's the only way I know to go. The Jew Holocaust lasted 10 years. But the Holocaust of the black man and woman lasted over 500 years. Let's look at it. 1 10 years, 1 500 years. Maybe I'm a little confused. Maybe I'm too much of a racist. Maybe I'm too much of a bigot and an anti-Semite when I'm really none of that. But maybe just by chance, 10 years is greater than 500 years. Let's kick the ballistics. You say you lost 6 million, and we question that. You say you lost 6 million, but for the sake of argument, we'll give you 6 million. We lost over 600 million lives in the the black Holocaust over the past 6,000 years and over the past 400 to 500 years in specific. Maybe I'm a little bit confused. Maybe I'm too big a racist or an anti-Semite or a bigot. And maybe somehow 6 million is greater than 600 million. That possibility is there. You have your Schindler's List, which is really a swindler's list. Because you were involved in the slave trade. You were involved, and you don't want to actually accept your involvement because you too want to escape reparations. You want to escape reparations and what is due the black man and black woman. Let's look at it. You talk about the death marches. My guide was a very nice lady, Miss Sarah Bloomfield. She worked very closely with my son, Farrakhan, and I as we were there. And we listened to Miss Bloomfield closely and carefully. We didn't go in for a show. We went in to study. We went in to do research. It wasn't a media event. We didn't even allow the media to go in with us so they would be following us around, looking at us at everything we were trying to feel and study. My son and I, we looked. Yes, we were sensitive to what we saw, pain and suffering. We're the chosen people of God. We are a spiritual people by nature, and we feel the pain and suffering of any people anywhere on the face of the planet Earth, even the people who helped to put us in this condition. So maybe we need to reevaluate that. My son looked at some of the Germans killing the Jews, so-called Jews, and he said, "This is sick, Daddy." And as we looked at it, feeling that, we saw where you talked about the death marches, where the Jews were forced in mass to move from one camp to the next camp, from one ghetto to the next ghetto. But what about the death marches in Africa? What about the sons and daughters of Africa put on desperate death marches for economic gain and financial purposes as we were marched hundreds of miles, some of us dying in the heat of the sun, trying to move us from the East Coast to the West Coast, trying to move us from Southern Africa back to a coastal area, or from the northern region to a coastal area? What about the massive death marches that took our lives on the African continent? You say you were herded away in boxcars. Where's the photo? Bring it around, Brother Steve. You were herded in boxcars. We were brought in the holds of slave ships. You say it was 1619, but white folks do lie. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad and the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan teach us that we came here in the year 1555. We didn't come on the Nina, the Pinta, nor the Santa Maria, not that way. And we didn't come on the Mayflower. We didn't land at Plymouth Rock. We got hit in the head with the damn rock. We came in the holds of ships to be made burden bearers for white America, stacked and packed like sardines in a can and like cockroaches in a Coke bottle. We lost over 150 to 200 million black lives just in the Middle Passage, just coming over between Africa and America. We have not only experienced a Holocaust, but we have paid a hell of a cost. I didn't come here tonight to be soft at a black Holocaust observance. The Catholic Church admitted their role in slavery. The so-called Jews want to lie. We just were 2% of the population. Don't make no difference what percent you were. 75% of you, 2/3 of you, according to your own Jewish census takers and statistics, were involved in the slave trade. I didn't say 75% of all the slaves were owned by the Jews. I said 75% of the Jews owned slaves. But you put a spin on it and a twist on it to make it seem ridiculous because you're just a liar and the truth is not in you.
The truth of this book, which was the discussion or the subject matter, the secret relationship between blacks and Jews. I agree with. I have in my possession here some quotes from this book that state that Jewish people, not only Gentiles, not only Arabs, but Jewish people were prominent in the slave trade. If they were prominent in the slave trade, and by the way, this book is not written by the Nation of Islam. These are quotes from eminent Jewish rabbis and scholars, none of whom are considered anti-Semitic. They have said that Jews were slaveholders in Curaçao, in Suriname, in Barbados, throughout the Caribbean. They said that Jewish slaveholders used to cut off the hand of those that fought for freedom and give it to others or sell it to others. They said, we didn't say it, they said it. If Brother Collins had just quoted the book, nobody would have been able to condemn him or call him anti-Semitic. They said, listen, or we say, that the same man that the Simon Wiesenthal Center used to try to trash this book, a Dr. Brackman. We have that man's doctoral dissertation, which is unpublished. But in his doctoral dissertation, he agrees with everything that we said in this book. And he also went further to say that the Jewish Talmudic scholars were the ones who invented the myth of the curse of Ham. That all these black people all over the world who are Christians have suffered the mental anguish of believing that we are black because of some divine curse. Yes, we have an argument, a strong argument.
Brackman made the mistake of writing a PhD dissertation in 1977 from UCLA. His dissertation is called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a study of black-Jewish relations up to 1900. The arrogance and intolerance and ignorance of people who oppress us is absolutely amazing sometimes. They feel that they can write things in their books for their own consumption, but they underestimate our intelligence to such an extent that somehow when they write this foolishness in their books, they figure we will never have the sense to go and read their books and quote them. And of course, when we quote them, and when they realize to their great consternation that not only can we read and write, but we are a million times smarter than they are, because let's face it, the intellectual superiority claimed by those who oppress us is nothing but a big bubble. And we are fortunate enough to be living in a time when that bubble is being comprehensively burst. And that's the reason for the hysteria and the madness that we're seeing in the press every day today. That's the reason why day after day in the major media you can see Jewish colonists saying that Jews never enslaved Africans, when the record is so clear, so well documented by their own historians.
This book is written by all Jewish scholars, all Jewish respected writers, scholars, publishing houses, clergy. That is what you will find in this book. We have compiled from research from among all Jews what Jews have to say about whose? About Jews. The book, as we open it, as we dare to open it, on the King College campus, The information contained herein has been compiled primarily from Jewish historical literature. Every effort has been made to present evidence from the most respected of Jewish authorities. From the most respected of what? Jewish authorities, whose works appear in established historical journals, are published by authoritative Jewish publishing houses. Now let's get started. Throughout the history of the practice, Jews and the African slave trade, Jews have been involved in the purchase and sale of human beings. This fact is confirmed by their own scholars and historians. Whose scholars and historians? In his book, A History of the Jews, Solomon Grazel, a Jew, states that Jews, quote, were among the most important slave dealers. What did he say? They were among the most important what? Slave dealers in European society. Lady Magnus writes that in the Middle Ages, quote, the principal purchasers of slaves were found among the Jews. They seemed to be always and everywhere at hand to buy and to have the means equally ready to pay. Henry L. Feingold, and they're always looking for gold, stated that Jews who were frequently found at the heart of commerce could not have failed to contribute a proportionate share to the slave trade directly or indirectly.
This controversy assumed enormous proportions. I'm still surprised. Here was something as simple as my teaching this information, which is all well documented. The book that I was using, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, put out by the Nation of Islam, that book relies almost 100% on Jewish sources. But what is interesting, though, is that even though the Jewish academics and authoritative sources like the Encyclopedia, excuse me, Judaica, even though these sort of academic, esoteric Jewish sources were quite forthcoming in acknowledging their role in the slave trade, the popular Jewish press and the popular Jewish populace, I guess, many of them were either unaware of all this or refused to believe it.
As a secret relationship between blacks and Jews, claiming the Jews were large-scale slave owners. It is said to be based on Jewish writings, but scholars have criticized the book as inaccurate and distorted. The statistics that you give can be rebuked and refuted by Jewish scholars, but I'd like to go beyond you and me arguing about how many Jews there were as slaveholders. That was over 100 years ago. We now have relations with Germany. We don't hold what happened in Hitler's Germany against the young Germans. Why now are the sins of the fathers being visited upon the sons?
Miss Walters, you have relationships with Germany today because Germany has moved to right a terrible wrong.
Why pick on the Jews particularly, which is what you've done?
I have not picked on the Jews in particular. You know, this idea of a victim.
No. It's not the secret history of blacks and whites, or blacks and Scots, or blacks and Italians. It's blacks and Jews.
And the reason for that, Miss Walters, is because we all know that Gentile whites had some part in it. But there are many Jews who do not know the role that some Jews played in the slave trade, and it was a prominent role. But whether it was marginal or prominent, the fact of the matter is Jews have succeeded in the world. Blacks are at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder.
The end result of all this is that the role of Jews in the slave trade, something which was unknown to many folks prior to 1993, something which was largely unknown to me, because of the hullabaloo created by the Jewish media and so on, I think that has, in a sense, had an effect that they perhaps did not anticipate. And that is that something which was in fact a secret relationship is no longer secret. The whole world is now aware of the fact, thanks to the hullabaloo created by the Jewish media, of the Jewish involvement in the slave trade. And even though there has been an incredible effort since 1993 on the part of the Jewish media to sort of counterattack. For example, the Amistad movie was part of that counterattack. The Amistad movie very subtly suggested that Africans were the ones responsible for their own enslavement. The Amistad movie, put out by Steven Spielberg, actually had an African slave. Imagine this. Steven Spielberg actually had an African slave in the Amistad movie saying, I did not see the movie, by the way, I refused to see it, but I was told that Spielberg actually had an African slave in this movie saying that he was so sorry for the great suffering that, the Jews had gone through, and whatnot. And that nobody in the world, this was an African slave. A man who was on death row, in jail, fighting for his life as an African slave. And Spielberg has this man saying that he had just read the Bible, and these folks had suffered so much, etc., etc. Nobody in the world had suffered as much as they had. That too is one of the means by which the Jewish establishment has tried to kind of cover up, their own involvement in the slave trade. I don't know how many books on the slave trade have been published by Jews in the last 6-7 years. I have lost count, but it could easily be a dozen. That they keep just churning out these books. But the more noise they make, the more people become aware of the fact that, that there is a Jewish involvement in the slave trade. So I think that to a large extent, I think they have kind of shot themselves in the foot this time around. They have let the genie out of the bottle. I don't know how they'll ever get that genie back in the bottle. I don't think they'll find a way.
The Jews were a rather important factor in black servitude in the New World, and probably one of the greatest benefactors of that peculiar institution. To properly understand and appreciate the black-Jewish relations in early American history, one must go beyond the boundaries of these United States, which were an insignificant part of European colonial expansion in the 16th and 17th centuries. Furthermore, to get a picture of the relationship, one must even start from the beginning, the so-called age of discovery. It is this dimension, I believe, that can best open the history of the Jewish participation in the founding and the development of the New World, which, of course, its central economy was slavery. It is probably one of the greatest coincidences of history that Africa and the Americas, the two important ingredients in the slave trade, were discovered about a decade apart by Portugal and Spain, the two European countries which existed almost exclusively on Jewish wealth. A careful study of the documents of Spain and Portugal will prove that almost the entire New World enterprise was made possible by Jewish aid, and it now appears that Christopher Columbus was little more than a managing director of Israel. Our school textbooks taught us that the king and queen of Spain sold their jewels in order to obtain money to finance the adventures of Columbus. But it is now better known that the first voyage of Columbus was made possible not by the sacrifice of Isabella and Ferdinand, but by the loan from Louis de Santangel, a Jewish financier of the King's Council of Spain. We are now aware that by the time of the second journey, 1492, the year of the Jewish expulsion from these parts, most of the Jewish wealth which was confiscated was used by King Ferdinand to finance the second journey. It is now fairly well documented that the interpreter and the physician of Columbus on his second voyage were Jewish men, and that the first man to set foot on the American soil from Columbus's boat was Louis de Torres, a Jew, the Jewish interpreter of Columbus. But even more, and this is way out, Columbus himself was part Jewish. His mother, Susana Ponteresa, was said to be a Jewish. I can be corrected by the eminent scholar here. If the above findings are correct, it is then correct to say that the so-called discovery of the New World was partly a Jewish enterprise, and that it came into being almost providentially as a refuge for Spanish and Portuguese Jews, whose expulsion from Spain and Portugal coincided with the discovery. With the opening of the New World, the Jews were the first Europeans to settle in them, and it was they who introduced much of the economic know-how to the new colonies, and know-how that demanded slave labor. It is no exaggeration to state that the Jews were the first traders in the New World, and that they also may have been the first planters. For as early as 1492, we find that the Portuguese Jews in St. Thomas, now the Virgin Islands, were in St. Thomas, now the Virgin Islands, and were the first large-scale plantation owners with as much as 3,000 African slaves. But if the Jews fared badly on the continent under Portugal and Spain as a result of the expulsion, they soon dominated the colonial expansion of the Dutch and the English. In addition, they probably used their talent and wealth to destroy the hegemony of Portugal and Spain in the New World. That's something to look at. It is soon revealed that the Jews owned large shares in the Dutch East and West India companies, and in the Dutch colonial expansion the Jews were so dominant that we read of a Cohen as one of the early governors of the Dutch East India Company. It is also revealed that these companies facilitated the Dutch American colonies and later drove the Portuguese from the slave castles of West Africa. Elmina and Coromantine are two of them. Further, the Dutch and the Jews were so closely tied up in their colonial expansion and later in the slave trade that the two people were distinguishable only by quotation marks. That is to say, when references are made of the Jews as Dutchmen, the word Dutchmen was generally in quotation marks. We have already mentioned that by 1492 the Portuguese were in St. Thomas as planters, and by the time of 1550 the sugar plantations there had reached 60 in number. But the greatest involvement of Jews in the colonial period was to be found probably in Brazil. There the Jews transplanted techniques of the sugar industry either from St. Thomas or from the Madeiras, where the Jews had been engaged in the sugar trade for quite some time. Now Brazil was by far the largest Portuguese colony, American colony in the colonial period, and the Jews took advantage of this new El Dorado. So large was their refugees' migration in the 16th century that Queen Joan took measures to limit the migration of Jews in 1511. But the Jews proved so beneficial to the crown and country that the ban was lifted in 1577. Thus, with the settlement of the Jews in Brazil, the first phase of its plantation industrial development began. By 1549, one of the earliest governors of Brazil was a Jew, Tomé de Souza. Incidentally, it was under another Jewish governor, Iris de Souza Castro, that the largest African republic in the New World was brutally destroyed. The Republic of Palmares, which was made up of runaway slaves in Pernambuco, Brazil, was destroyed by the insistence of this governor. In 1644, the Dutch occupied Brazil, and many rich Jews from Holland arrived. By the middle of the 17th century, all the large plantations belonged to the Jews. Newhoff, who traveled in Brazil from 1644 to 49, wrote, "Among the free inhabitants of Brazil, the Jews were the most considerable in number, who had transplanted themselves thither from Holland. They had a vast traffic beyond the rest. They purchased sugar mills and built stately homes in the Recife. They were all traders, which would have been of great consequence to the Dutch Brazil had they kept themselves within the due bounds of traffic. Another writer speaking to this point said of them, the profit they make after 9 or 10 years in these lands are so marvelous, for they all come back to Holland rich. That could have been I don't believe that, but so on, so on. Incidentally, it was soon after the Dutch captured Brazil that their trade in slaves began. Albert van Danzig and Barbara Pitti, in their book A Short History of the Forts and Castles of Ghana, said of the Dutch, in this respect their volte-face is remarkable. At first, when they did not have any plantation colonies, the Dutch Calvinists had maintained a holier-than-thou attitude, strongly condemning the popish practice of using slave labor. But as soon as they themselves realized the vast profits which could be derived from it, they readily discovered the appropriate text in the scripture to justify it. The capture of Elmina was done by the Dutch West India Company, and I am prepared to show that this company was dominated by Jews during the slave trade. Thus, as early as 1553, according to Hakluyt's principal navigations, voyages, traffics, and discoveries of the English nations, the first English voyage to Elmina was under the navigation of a Portuguese captain named Antonio Anes Penteado. This man was described as a renegade from Portugal, but a man of expert knowledge of the African and Brazilian waters, 1553. After reaching Elmina with his 140 men, and after trading a lot of garbage for gold, the director in charge of the expedition, one Wyndham, wanted to go on to Benin for more loot. Penteado, who knew the dangers of the African weather, counseled against such a trip, and a controversy developed. It was in this controversy that the real identification of Penteado was revealed. I quote, and being counseled of the said Penteado, considering the late time of the year, for that time to go no further but to make sale of their wares such as they had for gold, whereby they might have been great gainers, Wyndham, not assenting hereunto, fell into a sudden rage, reviling the said Penteado, calling him a Jew, with other opprobrious words, saying, this whoresome Jew hath promised to bring us to such places as are not, or as he cannot bring us unto, but if he do not, I will cut off his ears and nail them to the mast. The bloody man. Here it is clear that as early as 1553, the Jews were in the service of the Portuguese African trade to Brazil and that of the English also. The quotations show that Penteado knew both the African and the Brazilian waters, and many scholars know that slaves were being taken to Brazil during the first half of the 16th century. But to come back to my point of the Dutch West India Company, this company was in charge of the African-Brazilian slave trade, and we learn from the Danzig-Pitti work, quoted above, that the Director General of the Elmina Castle in 1679 was one Herman Abrams. That sounds all right to me. Now, the many slave castles of the Dutch West India Company can still be found along the Ghana coast to this day. Although the Jews, along with the Dutch, were expelled from Brazil in 1654, many of the richer Jews remained in Brazil under the Portuguese and simply converted from Judaism to Christianity and became known as New Christians. Lovely. Crypto Jews. On the other hand, others simply left Brazil and went to New Amsterdam and also to Suriname, which, for all intent and purpose, was a slave state owned to a great extent by the Jews. In 1730, out of 344 sugar plantations, on the island of Suriname, the Jews owned 115 of them. The Bank of Amsterdam, heavily Jewish, had a mortgage of 60 million gulden on Suriname alone. But there is only a little time to mention such countries as Martinique, where in 1655 we find the first large plantation in that island owned by one Benjamin da Costa. A Jewish refugees from Brazil, along with 900 of his co-religionists, with their 1,100 slaves. Or San Domingo, where sugar mills were introduced in 1587. The record shows that it was not until the Dutch refugees, in quotation, arrived in the island that any degree of success was achieved in sugar. Anyone who knows French economic history will remember that about this time the Jews almost monopolized the sugar trade in France, which was controlled by the wealthy family of the grandees of Bordeaux. In 1701, the Council of Trade in Paris states, French shipping owes its splendor to the commerce of the sugar-producing islands, and it is only by means of this that the navy can be maintained. I need only recall to your attention the names of French Jewish financiers who were the benefactors of this trade. Along with the grandees, we may see later the DuPont and the Rothschilds, etc. When dealing with the English colonies, one should first commence with Barbados and Jamaica. I have already dealt with Suriname, which in the colonial period was the pawn of both British and the Dutch. The Jews of Barbados and Jamaica formed the economic infrastructure of these islands. The Jews were in Barbados from the start of the penal colony, and they monopolized the trade of that island. And as Barbados was the pilot project for the West Indian sugar industry, we can rest assured that it was the Jews who developed this industry in the island, or partly so. In time, there was a petition to the Crown to exclude them, and I don't believe they would ask for that if they were not in the business. Jamaica was taken from the Spaniards in 1655. Its early foreign inhabitants were both Spanish Christians and Portuguese Jews. On the invasion of the English, the Spaniards fled to Cuba. The Portuguese, who were mostly Jews, remained in Jamaica and became British subjects. But by this time, the Jews in the British colonies were well favored by a British proclamation which granted them wide privileges. This 1635 proclamation said, immediately on reaching the colony, every person belonging to the Hebrew nation shall possess and enjoy every liberty and privilege possessed by and granted to the citizens and inhabitants of the colony, and shall be considered English-born. In my mind, there is no question that this proclamation of the 17th century was designed to get the Jews out of England, in which the Jews were almost totally disenfranchised and existed only on the faith of a true Christian. But the proclamation placed the Jews in a very strong position in the English colony. Some of these privileges were, 1, they should not be compelled to serve in any public office. Very convenient privilege. 2, their person and property shall be placed under the special protection of the government. This was not so with the slaves. They should be allowed to practice their religion without hindrance, along with the permission to erect synagogues, schools, and cemeteries. 4, the only prohibition to Jews in the colony was that they were prohibited to buy white slaves. Thus the African names, the black names. And the reason for this proclamation was because they had proven themselves useful and beneficial to the colony. The Jews in the colonies then were placed among the ruling class as far as privilege was concerned, and this was inevitable because the entire fabric of the colonial system was somewhat dependent on the mercy of Jewish financiers in England and in the colonies. In the 18th century, Jews paid almost all the taxes of Jamaica. And this, of course, was because they were the ones who had it. I am giving you the background here so that you can interpret what I mean by when you talk about black-Jews relation. You have to look carefully on what you're talking about. Now, from the time of Queen Elizabeth down through Cromwell, the Jews were at court calling the cards in England. There was nothing more important than having friends at court. King William III, after the Restoration, was so indebted to Francesco Lopez Suazo, Baron de Avernus de Grasse of Holland, who is said to have loaned him 2 million guldens on his ascension to the throne, and as a result invited the Baron to settle in England. To this day, the Suazos are still in Jamaica. The entity known as the United States only became possible thanks to a chain of circumstances in which the Jews played no small part. If I may anticipate a little, it may be well said that the American colonies were only able to achieve independence by the help of wealthy Jewish firms which laid the economic foundation for the new republic. The entry of the Jews in Amsterdam in 1654 must then be considered an epoch of great historical importance for both the United States and the Jews themselves. When the Dutch governor refused to give permanent settlement for the Jews to live and do business in the colony, he was soon sent a letter from the Dutch East India Company to cool it. And I quote, "Because of the large amount of capital which they have invested in shares in this company." Later, when Amsterdam became New York, there was no real problem for the Jews because the English proclamation which gave English-born status to the Jews was now in force. By 1740, they were Englishmen by acts of parliament. Rhode Island, with one of the most favorable constitutions, welcomed the Jews, as did Pennsylvania. So the Jews entered the United States not as a poor slave, but as free men ready to do business, and that business was slavery and the slave trade. The ships of the state of New York will attest to this. Now, in the southern states, and I'm coming to the end, South Carolina was favorable to the Jews from its beginning. The constitution drafted by John Locke at the end of the 17th century provided that any 7 persons may form a religious organization. It seems that the Jews took advantage of this quite early, for to this day the word Jewland in South Carolina is synonymous with large plantation estates. Going further south to Georgia, one finds that when James Oglethorpe set out to form that colony, 3 of the trustees were none other than 3 of the most wealthy Jews of England, namely Alvaro Lopez Suazo of the financial family mentioned above, Francis Salvador, director of the Dutch East India Company, famous financier, philanthropist, and owner of large tracts of land in South Carolina then, and Anthony da Costa, Jewish director of the Bank of England. Have mercy, Lord. With their money, they sent a shipload of Jews, both Sephardic and Ashkenazic, to the Georgian colony. This incident was highly embarrassing to Oglethorpe, but he could do nothing about it. He who pays the piper calls the tune. Now, the Jewish participation in black servitude then cannot be underestimated. Slavery and slave trading was the economy par excellence of the Americas, and at the center of the economy were the Jews. In the final analysis then, referring specifically to Dr. Korn's paper, I have shown that from the beginning the Jews were parts and parcels of the peculiar institution, and if the Jews had anything to do with it, we would still be in chains, I think. That's hard, but I'll soften it later. Now, a few voices here and there spoke against the inhumanity, but the moral teachings of Judaism had no real influence on slavery. The number of slaves owned by the Jews in the colonial period cannot be taken on face value by referring only to those slaves owned by individuals and a few owners. Many of the plantations were run by absentee landlords, some of them Jews. I would suggest probably that the fact that many of the names given as Protestants and Catholic owners of plantation were in fact pseudonyms. With regard to the census state data given by Dr. Korn, these probably are somewhat unreliable. Roger Bastille, in his book African Civilization in the New World, quoted research of Stedman in Suriname and alluded to the fact that the Jukas and the Salamanca Maroon communities of the Suriname bush came into being on account of the Jewish practice of sending many of their slaves to the bush on the day the slave assessors came to count the number of slaves owned by each Jewish planter. The slaves finally seized upon the practice to make sure of their freedom. The thriving Maroon communities in Suriname, known as the Bush Negroes, are still living in Suriname today and have preserved their African customs since the 16th century. They have become a veritable anthropological laboratory for African retention, and the American census, therefore, should not be taken too seriously. In every other respect, I agree with Dr. Korn's paper and see it as an objective presentation of the facts about the Jews and their relations to the blacks in this country. It is probably no coincidence that Dr. Korn now supervises Knesset Israel, the rabbinate once held by David Einhorn, the great Jewish scholar, rabbi, and abolitionist. My one conclusion is that the Jewish relationship with the blacks has been historically one of convenience. Blacks for the Jews meant business, and wherever it has been possible, this relation has been parasitic and only symbiotic when Jewish survival in the black community is involved. It is my conviction that the larger part of the Jewish community feels no real obligation to black suffering in these United States. The relationship continues to be a neutral one, neutral end, and in no way a mutual one. The black community is in dire need of Jewish economic know-how as a reparation for serving as a scapegoat of white hostility in the United States, which protected the Jews from serious repercussions which would have been inevitable were not the black presence here to cushion it. If the Jews still have a divine mission, as I think they do, if they are still responding to a God of righteousness and justice, we must hope to expect the Jews to set some example in these days when righteousness and justice seem to have taken a vacation. But probably we need more prophets and less rabbis. Amen.
Yes, it is true. We now know that Jews were very importantly involved in the slave trade in medieval times, both, as Professor Clark has said, in the East, in the Arabic areas, and also in Europe. That is even before our African slave trade to the Americas. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that Jews were heavily invested in the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West India Company, that company which was a private corporation doing the job of colonizing, which was responsible in large measure for the African slave trade. The Dutch West India Company that owned the Elmina Fort in what is now Ghana. The Dutch West India Company that brought slaves from Africa to the Caribbean, to South America. The same Dutch West India Company that brought the first slaves to New York when it was still New Amsterdam. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the Jews were the major element in the slave trade in Brazil in the 1600s, in Suriname, in Curacao, in Barbados, in Jamaica. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that the two largest single shipments of slaves coming into this country in the 18th century were on ships owned by Jews. It is true, as we now know, that Aaron Lopez, biggest slave ship owner in the United States of America, was a Jew. It is also true, as we now know, that all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island, in the era of the slave trade were owned by Jews. Rum, as we know, was a very important item in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, it is true, as we now know, that there was a higher per capita ownership of slaves in the United States of America by Jews than by white Gentiles. We now know from the 1830 census of the US of A that something like 75% of Jewish households own slaves, as opposed to just 30-odd% for the white population as a whole. All of this information is contained in the secret relationship between blacks and Jews. And all of this information is based on the work of Jewish historians. So how come that we have a situation, an amazing situation developing here, where the Jewish leadership in this country is trying to deny the undeniable? And the only reason why the Jewish leadership has been able to place itself into this untenable and indefensible position, it seems to me, is because they have become drunk with power. They have gotten into the habit of easy victories over our people. Professor Clark said no more easy victories. They have won some easy victories in the past, and they have become so drunk with the power coming out of those easy victories, and have become so arrogant and so conceited that they have come to the point now where they believe that they can in fact defend the indefensible. The Jeffries case has shown that the time has come to an end, that from now on they will be forced to deal on an intellectual level with an aroused black community, and once we force them to deal on an intellectual level, the Jeffries case has shown, and I hope that my case will show, that they cannot win. Jewish power over black institutions in this country is based in large measure on the apparent liberalism of Jews in relation to black people in the 20th century. And what this book does, by showing the Jewish role in slavery and the slave trade, it punctures that balloon, that liberal balloon. It shows that Jews were in fact not a liberal community as far as black people were concerned for most of the history of Africans in America. And so as soon as that balloon is punctured, the whole apparatus of Jewish power over black people, which rests on this alleged Jewish liberalism, then becomes in a very perilous situation. And that, to my mind, partially explains the frenetic, crazy, insane way in which the Jewish community has tried to defend the indefensible by trying to deny their involvement in the African slave trade. Now, Jewish liberalism, like I said, is a 20th century phenomenon. Apparent Jewish liberalism is a 20th century phenomenon. Clearly, they weren't liberals during the slave trade if 75% of the Jewish households had slaves, and if they owned the largest shipments of slaves coming to this country, and if they owned all the rum distilleries in Newport, Rhode Island.
Now let's look at Zionism and let us close, because Zionism is an extension of European mechanism of world dominance.
Any Jew who was in business was almost guaranteed in the southern towns to have dealings with slaves in one way or another. Leaders of Jewish communities participated in the slave system without apology. Most Jews, prior to the Civil War in the South, Most Jews in the North accepted slavery as the natural course of the events.
The Jewish participation in black servitude then cannot be underestimated. Slavery and slave trading was the economy par excellence of the Americans, and at the center of the economy were the Jews.
Yes, it is true, as we now know. The Jews were heavily invested in the Dutch West India Company.
The Catholic Church admitted their role in slavery. The so-called Jews want to lie. We just were 2% of the population. Don't make no difference what percent you were. 75% of you, 2/3 of you, according to your own Jewish census takers and statistics, were involved in the slave trade. I didn't say 75% of all the slaves were owned by the Jews. I said 75% of the Jews owned slaves. But you put a spin on it and a twist on it to make it seem ridiculous because you're just a liar and the truth is not in you.
This book is one of the tools the nation uses to point out what it sees as wrong. It details what the Nation of Islam's research department as a secret relationship between blacks and Jews. Claiming the Jews were large-scale slave owners, it is said to be based on Jewish writings.
And I say to Jewish people who are present, look, you get this book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. You get this book. I've sent it to every Jewish leader, rabbi, all the Congressional Black Caucus, all the black leaders, leading persons in media. This is our research of the history written by Jewish historians and theologians from their own pens. This is no writing of Louis Farrakhan or any quote-unquote anti-Semite. This is from the Jews themselves. This is not anti-Semitism. This is just fact.